Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most scandalous, most decadent, and perhaps most dangerous palace that ever existed on Earth. Picture this, a place where nobles gambled away entire provinces in a single night, where mistresses wielded more power than queens, and where a single party could cost more than feeding an entire city for a year. What if I told you that behind the golden mirrors of Versailles, the French aristocracy didn't just live in luxury, they drowned in it, and that drowning would eventually pull down an entire empire? Tonight, we're stepping through those gilded doors into a world where pleasure wasn't just pursued, it was weaponized, worshipped, and ultimately became the very poison that destroyed the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Now, before we slip into this world of forbidden indulgences together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, but only if tonight's story truly captivates you. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Your bedroom, maybe a cozy corner somewhere? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back in time together to discover what really happened when absolute power met absolute pleasure. Welcome to Versailles in the year 1682. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of 100 musicians playing in your garden. Imagine your breakfast served on plates worth more than most people's homes, your clothes sewn with threads of actual gold, and your every whim attended to by servants who bow so low they nearly kiss the marble floors. This was life at the court of Versailles, and for nearly a century it was the center of the civilized world. But here's what your history textbooks probably didn't tell you. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was the world's most expensive prison, wrapped in silk and painted in gold. You see, when Louis XIV moved his entire court from Paris to this sprawling complex 37 miles outside the city, he wasn't just showing off his wealth, he was setting a trap. And every single French nobleman walked right into it with a smile on their face. Let me paint you a picture of a typical day at Versailles. The Sun King, as Louis XIV called himself, would wake up each morning and this is completely true, dozens of the highest-ranking nobles in France would literally fight for the honor of watching him get dressed. Can you imagine? These were dukes, counts, princes of the blood, grown men with vast estates and armies at their command, and they would wake up before dawn just to stand in a room and watch their king put on his stockings. The Duke of Orleans once elbowed another nobleman in the ribs just to get a better view of the royal morning routine. If that's not the earliest form of reality TV, I don't know what is. But this seemingly ridiculous ritual served a brilliant if twisted purpose. While these powerful men were focused on court ceremonies, on who got to hold the king's shirt or pour his morning chocolate, they weren't back home on their estates building armies or plotting rebellions. Louis XIV had essentially turned the most dangerous men in France into glorified valets, and they loved every minute of it, because being close to the king meant access to his favor, his money, and his power. The numbers alone will make your head spin. Versailles employed over 5,000 people just to maintain the daily operations of the palace. The annual cost of running this pleasure palace was roughly 25% of France's entire national budget. To put that in modern terms, imagine if the US government spent about $1 trillion every year just on the White House and its parties. That's Versailles-level excess. And the parties? Oh, the parties. Louis XIV didn't just throw celebrations. He created theatrical productions that lasted for days. The most famous was The Pleasures of the Enchanted Isle in 1664, a week-long festival that featured jousting tournaments, elaborate ballets, fireworks displays that could be seen from 20 miles away, and banquets with over 30 courses served on solid gold plates. The entertainment budget for this single week cost more than building an entire city. One contemporary observer wrote that the fireworks alone consumed enough gunpowder to fight a small war, but here's where the story takes a darker turn and where we begin to see the cracks in this golden facade. Because while the king and his courtiers danced through gilded halls, outside those palace walls, ordinary French citizens were struggling to afford bread. The same year as those magnificent Enchanted Isle festivities, grain shortages caused food riots in several French provinces. The contrast wasn't lost on everyone. Some observers even then whispered that Versailles was becoming a beautiful monument to royal selfishness. Yet the courtiers couldn't see it, or perhaps they chose not to. They were too intoxicated by the privilege, too addicted to the pleasure, too afraid of losing their place in this golden circle. Being invited to Versailles meant you had made it to the very top of French society. Being excluded meant social death. So they played along with increasingly elaborate rituals, spent fortunes they didn't have on clothes and gifts to maintain their status, and slowly, without realizing it, traded their independence for proximity to power. The genius and the eventual downfall of Louis XIV's system was that he made luxury itself into a form of control. At Versailles, spending money wasn't just about enjoyment, it was about survival. If you couldn't afford the latest fashions, the most expensive gifts for the king's mistresses, the most elaborate parties to celebrate royal birthdays, you simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the court. Nobles borrowed themselves into bankruptcy just to maintain their positions, making them completely dependent on royal favour for their financial survival. But perhaps the most telling detail about life at Versailles was this. Despite all the gold, all the marble, all the elaborate fountains and manicured gardens, visitors consistently complained about one thing: the smell. You see, with thousands of people living in close quarters, with limited sanitation, and with the French aristocracy's rather casual relationship with bathing, the Palace of Versailles often reeked. Perfume wasn't just a luxury at Versailles, it was a necessity. Even paradise, it seems, came with a very human cost. As we settle in tonight, that contrast between the glittering surface and the messy reality underneath will be our guide through this story. Because Versailles wasn't just about beauty and luxury, it was about what happens when human desires are given unlimited resources and no boundaries. It was about what happens when pleasure becomes not just a pursuit, but the entire purpose of existence. And in our next chapter, we'll meet the man who built this golden prison, who declared himself the Sun King, and whose own hidden appetites and secret obsessions would shape not just France, but the entire concept of absolute power in the Western world. Because Louis XIV had desires that went far beyond what he showed the public, and some of those desires would lead to scandals that shocked even the jaded courtiers of Versailles. Now let me tell you about a man whose appetites were so carefully hidden that even today, historians debate whether we truly know the real Louis XIV. Behind the public image of the Sun King, the divine monarch who claimed God himself had chosen him to rule, lived a human being with desire so intense, so consuming, that they would reshape not just his own life, but the entire culture of European royalty for generations to come. Here's what will surprise you. The man who presented himself as the epitome of royal dignity and divine authority was, in private, absolutely obsessed with dancing. Not just enjoying it, obsessed. Louis XIV didn't just watch ballet performances, he choreographed them, starred in them, and used them as a form of political manipulation that was nothing short of genius. Picture the most powerful man in Europe, a king who controlled the fate of millions, spending hours every single day practicing pirouettes and grand jetés. His ballet master, Pierre Beauchamp, once recorded that the king practiced dance for a minimum of 2 hours every morning. even on days when he was supposed to be reviewing military strategies or meeting with foreign ambassadors. But here's where it gets really interesting and a little twisted. Louis XIV performed in over 80 ballet productions during his lifetime, and in nearly every single one, he cast himself as a god. Apollo, the sun god, was his favourite role, which is where his nickname Sun King actually came from. Imagine if a modern president insisted on starring as Superman in every Hollywood movie. The courtiers had no choice but to watch their king leap and twirl across the stage, and then applaud as if they'd witnessed the greatest performance in human history. Some historians believe this wasn't just vanity, it was psychological warfare. By literally positioning himself as a deity in these elaborate performances, Louis was programming his courtiers to see him as more than human. The king's dance obsession reached such extremes that he once delayed a crucial military campaign because he was perfecting a particularly challenging ballet sequence. His war minister, the Marquis de Louvois, wrote in a private letter that he had to wait 3 days to discuss urgent matters regarding the Dutch war because His Majesty was indisposed with matters of artistic expression. Meanwhile, French soldiers were literally dying in trenches, waiting for orders that were delayed because their commander-in-chief was working on his port de bras. But dancing was just the beginning of Louis XIV's hidden world. What the courtiers witnessed every day was a carefully crafted performance, but what happened behind closed doors would have scandalized even the most liberal nobles of his time. The Sun King had developed what we might today recognize as a serious gambling addiction, and he was remarkably good at hiding it from public view. Every night, after the formal court ceremonies ended and the public had retired, Louis XIV would gather with a small group of his closest confidants for card games that lasted until dawn. These weren't friendly poker nights. These were high-stakes psychological battles where the king would regularly bet amounts that could fund small armies. His favourite game was called Hoka, a precursor to modern roulette, and the losses recorded in the private royal accounts are staggering. In a single night in 1679, Louis XIV lost the equivalent of what we'd consider about $12 million in today's money. To put that in perspective, that was enough to feed the entire city of Paris for 2 weeks. The really disturbing part? The king expected his courtiers to lose along with him. Winning too often against Louis XIV was considered a form of treason. The Duc de Gramont once made the mistake of having a particularly lucky night at cards, winning a substantial sum from the king. Within a week he found himself mysteriously reassigned to a diplomatic mission in Poland, which, in the 17th century, was considered barely a step above exile to Siberia. The message was clear. You could play with the king, but you couldn't really beat him. Here's where Louis XIV's psychology becomes truly fascinating and a little troubling. Court observers noted that the king seemed to use these gambling sessions as a form of emotional regulation. When state affairs went poorly, when wars dragged on longer than expected, when tax collections fell short, when foreign diplomats delivered unfavourable news, Louis would gamble more heavily and more recklessly. It was as if he was trying to control fate itself through cards and dice. The Duchess of Orléans wrote in her memoirs that after receiving news of a particularly devastating military defeat, the king gambled for 14 straight hours, barely pausing to eat or drink. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Louis XIV's hidden character was how he used pleasure as a weapon against his own nobility. Every luxury at Versailles, every elaborate ceremony, every expensive entertainment served a calculated purpose: to make the French aristocracy financially and emotionally dependent on royal favour. The king understood something that modern psychologists have confirmed, that intermittent rewards are far more addictive than consistent ones. So Louis XIV would bestow magnificent gifts on courtiers unpredictably. One week, He might give a minor nobleman a diamond-encrusted snuff-box worth a fortune. The next month, that same nobleman might find himself completely ignored, not even acknowledged during the king's morning routine. This created a psychological dependency that was more powerful than any chain. Courtiers became addicted to royal attention the way modern people become addicted to social media likes. They never knew when the next dose of validation might come, so they could never stop trying to earn it. The Marquise de Sévigné, one of the most astute observers of court life, captured this dynamic perfectly in a letter to her daughter. "The king has made us all into children again, constantly seeking his approval, constantly afraid of his displeasure, constantly hoping for his favor. We who once commanded armies now compete for the privilege of lighting his candle." This psychological manipulation extended to the king's romantic life as well, though in ways that might surprise you. While Louis XIV is famous for his numerous mistresses, what's less well known is how methodically he used romantic jealousy as a tool of political control. The king would deliberately create love triangles among his courtiers, encouraging multiple nobles to compete for the same woman's attention, knowing that their romantic rivalries would prevent them from forming political alliances against him. One particularly elaborate example involved the beautiful Duchesse de Fontanges. Louis XIV encouraged no fewer than 4 different dukes to court her simultaneously, then sat back and watched as these powerful men who should have been focusing on affairs of state, spent their time and energy writing love poems, commissioning expensive jewelry, and occasionally challenging each other to duels over her affections. Meanwhile, while they were distracted by romance, the king was consolidating power and making decisions that affected their estates without their input or interference. The king's own romantic entanglements were equally strategic. When he took Madame de Montespan as his primary mistress, it wasn't just because of her beauty or charm, though she certainly possessed both. It was because she came from one of the most powerful noble families in France, and controlling her meant influencing an entire network of aristocratic relationships. Through his romantic relationship with one woman, Louis XIV gained leverage over dozens of the most influential families in the kingdom. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The king seemed to understand that he was trapped by the same system he had created. Private letters discovered in the royal archives centuries later reveal a man who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the constant performance his position required. In one particularly candid moment, writing to his confessor, Louis XIV admitted that he sometimes envied his own servants because they, at least, are allowed to have genuine emotions and honest reactions. The irony is almost heartbreaking. The man who had more power, more wealth, and more luxury than perhaps any human being in history felt imprisoned by his own success. He had created a world where everything was performance, where every pleasure was calculated, where even his most private moments served political purposes. In seeking to control everything and everyone around him, Louis XIV had created a golden cage for himself as well as his courtiers. And speaking of golden cages, there was one woman who would soon arrive at Versailles and challenge everything Louis XIV thought he knew about power, pleasure, and control. A woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, whose intelligence was rivaled only by her ruthlessness, and whose story would become so scandalous that it would eventually involve accusations of witchcraft, political assassination, and crimes that shocked even the jaded courtiers of the French court. Her name was Françoise Athénaïse de Rochechouart de Mortemart, but history knows her as Madame de Montespan, and her arrival at Versailles would transform the Sun King from hunter into hunted. Picture this: a woman so captivating that she could make the most powerful man in Europe abandon his wife, his mistresses, and nearly his throne, all with a single glance across a crowded ballroom. But what if I told you that same woman would eventually be accused of using black magic, poison, and murder to maintain her hold over the Sun King? And what if the evidence suggests she might actually have done it? Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, let's call her Athénaïs because that name is quite a mouthful, didn't just become Louis XIV's mistress. She became the unofficial Queen of France, wielding more real political power than the actual queen, controlling more wealth than most European monarchs, and ultimately orchestrating what historians now consider one of the most elaborate and dangerous schemes in royal history. When Athénaïs first arrived at Versailles in 1663, she was already married to the Marquis de Montespan, a decent but unremarkable nobleman who had the misfortune of being wed to a woman destined for much grander things. She was 23 years old, possessed of what contemporary observers described as devastating beauty, but more importantly, she had something far more dangerous than good looks. She had an intellect that could match the Sun King's own. Here's what made Athénaïs different from the parade of beautiful women who constantly surrounded Louis XIV. She didn't chase him. In fact, she seemed almost bored by him at first. While other court ladies practically fainted when the king looked in their direction, Athénaïs would engage him in witty banter, challenge his opinions on literature and philosophy, and, this was truly shocking at the time, occasionally disagree with him in public. For a man accustomed to absolute deference, her intellectual independence was like catnip. The king's current mistress at the time was Louise de la Vallière, a sweet, pious young woman who genuinely loved Louis XIV and wanted nothing more than to make him happy. She was, by all accounts, a lovely person, kind, generous, devoutly religious, and completely outmatched by what was coming. Because Athénaïs didn't just want to replace Louise, she wanted to eliminate her so thoroughly that it would be as if she had never existed. The campaign Athénaïs waged to win Louis XIV reads like a masterclass in psychological manipulation. First, she positioned herself as Louise's friend and confidant, offering sympathy and advice while subtly undermining the poor woman's confidence. She would say things like, "Oh Louise, you're so pure and innocent. The king must find that so refreshing after dealing with complex state matters all day." The compliment contained just enough of an insult to plant seeds of doubt, but Athénaïs' real genius lay in understanding exactly what Louis XIV was missing in his life: intellectual stimulation. While Louise would listen adoringly to the king's stories, Athénaïs would ask probing questions. While Louise would agree with his political decisions, Athénaïs would offer alternative perspectives that made him think. She turned conversation into seduction and intellect into aphrodisiac. The transformation was remarkable and swift. Within 6 months of seriously pursuing the king, Athénaïs had convinced Louis XIV to give her an apartment at Versailles directly above his own chambers, connected by a private staircase. This wasn't just convenient for romantic rendezvous. It was a public declaration that she had access to the king at all hours of the day and night. In the hierarchical world of Versailles, proximity to the king's physical person was the ultimate symbol of power, and the power went to her head in ways that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Athénaïs began using her influence over Louis XIV to reshape the entire court system for her own benefit. She convinced the king to create new positions and titles specifically for her relatives, essentially installing her family as a shadow government within Versailles. Her brother was made superintendent of the royal buildings. Her sister received one of the most prestigious positions available to court ladies, and her cousins were granted lucrative military commissions despite having no military experience whatsoever. But it was the money that really shows you how completely Athénaïs had captured the Sun King's devotion. The financial records from Louis XIV's personal treasury, discovered in the French National Archives in the 1970s, reveal expenditures that are almost unbelievable. In 1672 alone, the king spent what would amount to roughly $35 million in today's money just on jewellery for Athenais. That's separate from her clothing allowance, her housing expenses, her servants' salaries, and the small palace he built specifically for her use. And speaking of that palace, the king commissioned the architect Jules Ardouin Mansart to build Athenais her own private residence within the grounds of Versailles. This wasn't a modest cottage. It was a 60-room mansion complete with its own gardens, fountains, and staff of 200 servants. To put this in perspective, most European nobles lived in homes with fewer than 20 rooms total. Louis XIV built his mistress a residence larger and more luxurious than the official palaces of most kings. The real scandal, though, wasn't the money. It was how Athenais used her position to interfere in matters of state. Unlike previous royal mistresses who were content to influence fashion and court entertainments, Athenais began inserting herself into military and diplomatic decisions. She maintained her own network of spies throughout Europe, conducted unauthorized correspondence with foreign ambassadors, and on at least 3 documented occasions, convinced Louis XIV to reverse major policy decisions that she personally disagreed with. The most shocking example involved the War of the League of Augsburg. In 1688, when French military commanders were urging the king to pursue an aggressive campaign that might have ended the conflict quickly, Athenais intervened because she'd invested heavily in certain trading companies that would lose money if the war ended too soon. She literally convinced the Sun King to prolong a war that cost thousands of lives because it was personally profitable for her. When the Duc de Saint-Simon discovered this years later, he wrote in his memoirs that Madame de Montespan governed France with more absolute authority than the king himself, and with far less regard for the welfare of his subjects. But Athenais' true genius and ultimate downfall lay in how she maintained her hold over Louis XIV as they both aged. By the mid-1670s, she was no longer the stunning young woman who had first caught the king's eye, and she knew that newer, younger beauties were constantly arriving at court. So she began employing what can only be described as increasingly desperate measures to maintain her influence. This is where our story takes a turn into territory so dark that it reads like something out of a Gothic horror novel. Because Athenais, faced with the prospect of losing the position that had made her one of the most powerful women in Europe, apparently decided that if she couldn't keep the king's love through beauty and charm alone, she would keep it through other means, much darker means. Court observers began noting strange changes in Louis XIV's behaviour whenever he spent time with Athenais. The Duchess de Noailles recorded in her diary that the king would emerge from private meetings with his mistress in what seemed like a trance-like state, agreeing to requests he would normally refuse and making decisions that contradicted his usual judgment. Other courtiers whispered about unusual smells emanating from Athenais' apartments, sweet, cloying scents that seemed to linger in rooms long after she'd left them. And then there were the deaths. Starting in 1676, a curious number of people who had opposed Athenais' political schemes or threatened her position began dying under mysterious circumstances. These weren't obviously suspicious deaths. They appeared to be natural illnesses, sudden fevers, unexpected heart failures. But the pattern was unmistakable to those who were paying attention. The Count de Soissons noted in a letter to his brother that it has become remarkably unhealthy to cross Madame de Montespan in any serious way. What the court didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered for several more years, was that Athenais had begun consulting with some of the most notorious practitioners of black magic in Paris. She was purchasing love potions, commissioning curses against her rivals, and quite possibly ordering the assassination of anyone who threatened her position. But those revelations would come later, as part of a scandal so enormous that it would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy and force Louis XIV to confront the possibility that the woman he loved might be a murderer. For now, though, in the glittering halls of Versailles, Athénaïs reigned supreme, the unofficial queen of the most powerful nation in Europe. But empires built on deception and dark magic have a way of collapsing in spectacular fashion, and what was about to unfold would make everything we've discussed so far seem like a gentle warm-up for the real horror story that was brewing in the shadows of the Sun King's court. What started as whispered rumours about love potions and mysterious deaths would explode into the most shocking scandal in French royal history. A conspiracy so vast and so terrifying that it would force Louis XIV to choose between the woman he loved and the survival of his throne. Welcome to the Affair of the Poisons, where the glittering world of Versailles collided head-on with the dark underworld of 17th century Paris, and where pleasure didn't just turn deadly, it became a weapon of mass destruction. The year was 1679, and Paris Police Lieutenant Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie was investigating what seemed like a routine case of fortune-telling gone wrong. A woman named Marie Bosse had been arrested for selling what she claimed were inheritance powders, supposedly magical potions that would help clients receive inheritances more quickly. It sounded like typical street-level fraud, the kind of thing that happened in every major city. Lorraine expected to wrap up the case quickly and move on to more serious crimes. He had no idea he was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of French society, involved some of the most respected names at Versailles, and would ultimately implicate the king's own mistress in a plot that included everything from black magic ceremonies to cold-blooded murder. The first clue that this wasn't an ordinary case came when Marie Bosse, facing torture and execution, offered to trade information for her life. What she told Lorraine was so shocking that he initially didn't believe it. She claimed that her inheritance powders weren't magical at all. They were actual poison, designed to kill inconvenient husbands, rivals, and anyone else who stood between her wealthy clients and what they wanted. And according to Marie, she wasn't working alone. She was part of a network of poisoners, fortune-tellers, and black magic practitioners who'd been serving the French aristocracy for decades. The names Marie Bosse provided read like a who's who of Parisian high society. The Countess de Soissons, accused of poisoning her husband to marry her lover. The Duchess de Bouillon, suspected of eliminating 3 separate rivals for a man's affections. The Marquise d'Alluy, allegedly responsible for the deaths of at least 7 people who had opposed her various schemes. These weren't desperate criminals from the streets of Paris. These were women who dined at Versailles, who attended the king's ballets, who were invited to the most exclusive social events in France. But the investigation took an even more sinister turn when Lorraine began examining the methods these aristocratic criminals were using. This wasn't just about poison, though the poisoning was certainly extensive and sophisticated. The network had developed an entire system of what we might today call chemical warfare, with different poisons designed for different purposes and different victims. For elderly targets, they used a slow-acting arsenic compound that mimicked the symptoms of natural aging, allowing the victim to sicken and die over several months without arousing suspicion. For younger victims, they employed a mercury-based poison that caused symptoms similar to plague or fever, again deflecting suspicion from foul play. Most chilling of all, they had developed what they called succession powder, a tasteless, odorless compound that could be administered in tiny doses over weeks or months, gradually weakening the victim until their death appeared to be from natural causes. The technical sophistication of these poisons suggests that the conspirators had access to some of the most advanced chemical knowledge of their time. In fact, Lorraine's investigation revealed that the network included several university-trained physicians and even some members of the Royal Academy of Sciences. These weren't ignorant practitioners of folk magic. They were highly educated individuals who had weaponized their scientific knowledge for profit and personal gain. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of what the conspirators called inheritance ceremonies, elaborate rituals where wealthy clients would participate in black magic rites designed to curse their targets while simultaneously administering poison. These ceremonies, held in secret locations throughout Paris, combined psychological manipulation with actual murder, creating a bizarre fusion of superstition and cold-blooded calculation. Lorraine's investigators, working undercover, managed to attend several of these ceremonies and documented what they witnessed. Picture this: aristocratic women dressed in black robes, standing around tables covered with human skulls and burning candles, chanting Latin incantations while mixing deadly chemicals into wine goblets that would later be served to unsuspecting victims. The ceremonies lasted for hours and cost enormous sums of money. Some clients paid the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's currency for a single ritual. The psychological aspect of these ceremonies was perhaps as important as the actual poisoning. Clients who participated in the rituals became psychologically invested in their success, and the elaborate nature of the proceedings made them feel as though they were engaging with supernatural forces rather than committing mundane murder. It was a brilliant way to make wealthy people feel comfortable about becoming killers. As the investigation expanded, Lorraine uncovered evidence of dozens of suspicious deaths over the previous decade. The Marquis de Cessac, who had died suddenly just weeks before he was scheduled to change his will in favor of his nephew instead of his wife. The Count de Polignac, who had succumbed to a mysterious fever immediately after announcing his intention to remarry following his first wife's death. The Duchess de Fontanges, yes, the same beautiful woman who had been courted by multiple dukes at the king's encouragement, who had died of sudden illness just months after breaking off her relationship with one of her most persistent suitors. But the investigation's most shocking revelation was yet to come, because as Lorraine dug deeper into the network's client records, kept meticulously by the fortune teller Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin, he discovered payment records and correspondence that pointed to a client whose identity would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy. The evidence was circumstantial at first, coded references to a high-ranking lady who'd made substantial payments for both love potions and more sinister services. But as investigators pieced together the timeline of payments, the locations of meetings, and the specific requests made by this mysterious client, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The high-ranking lady's payments to La Voisin's network coincided perfectly with key moments in Madame de Montespan's relationship with Louis XIV. Large sums had been paid in 1667, just before Athénais had successfully displaced Louise de la Vallière as the king's primary mistress. Additional payments were made in 1672 and 1675, both years when rumours had circulated about the king's interest in other women, and most damning of all, substantial payments had been made for what La Voisin's records described as elimination services, targeting several court figures who had opposed Athénais' political schemes. The investigators also discovered detailed recipes for love potions that had allegedly been prepared specifically for use on Louis XIV himself. These weren't harmless folk remedies. They were sophisticated psychoactive compounds designed to induce dependency and emotional attachment. The recipes included ingredients like Spanish fly, mandrake root, and several compounds that modern toxicologists recognize as mild hallucinogens and mood-altering drugs. Even more disturbing were records of what La Voisin called black masses, corrupted religious ceremonies where consecrated hosts were stolen from churches and used in rituals designed to curse the king's wife and other rivals. These ceremonies, according to the detailed confessions extracted under torture from multiple participants, had been attended by a woman matching Athénais' exact description on at least 6 separate occasions. By early 1680, Lorraine had compiled a case file that contained enough evidence to arrest and try some of the most powerful people in France. But he faced a dilemma that went to the very heart of absolute monarchy. What do you do when your investigation implicates the king's beloved mistress in crimes that could carry the death penalty? The situation became even more complicated when Lorraine realized that several of the deaths connected to the poison network had political implications that extended far beyond personal vendettas. If Madame de Montespan had indeed been eliminating people who opposed her political schemes, then she'd effectively been conducting her own foreign policy through assassination, potentially undermining Louis XIV's carefully crafted diplomatic relationships with other European powers. As Lorraine prepared to present his findings to the king, he knew he was about to create a crisis that could destroy not just individuals, but the entire system of royal government that Louis XIV had spent decades constructing. Because how do you tell the Sun King that the woman he loves, the woman who has borne him children, the woman who has been his closest confidant for over a decade, might be one of the most dangerous criminals in French history? And what Lorraine didn't yet know was that his investigation had only scratched the surface of a conspiracy that would ultimately reveal just how far the French aristocracy had fallen into a world of corruption, murder, and moral decay. The affair of the poisons was about to expose a society where the pursuit of pleasure had become so twisted that even the most sacred institutions had been corrupted, and where the line between love and murder had been erased entirely. Sometimes the most dangerous addiction isn't to drugs or alcohol, it's to winning. And in the glittering halls of Versailles, where image was everything and losing face could mean social death, the French nobility had developed a gambling obsession so severe that it would literally destroy the economic foundation of the most powerful empire in Europe. What started as elegant entertainment became a fever that consumed fortunes, destroyed families, and ultimately helped topple a 1,000-year-old monarchy. Here's something that will blow your mind. By 1685, the average French nobleman was spending more money on gambling in a single year than most European kings spent on running their entire governments. We're not talking about friendly card games or casual betting. We're talking about a systematic addiction that had transformed the French aristocracy into what we might today recognize as a society of compulsive gamblers, each one desperately trying to maintain appearances while hemorrhaging money they didn't actually have. The gambling culture at Versailles started innocently enough. Louis XIV, despite his secret nighttime gaming sessions, initially encouraged modest card games as a way to keep his courtiers entertained and social. The problem was that modest wasn't in the vocabulary of French aristocrats. What began as small-stakes entertainment quickly escalated into high-stakes psychological warfare, where your ability to bet enormous sums without flinching became a measure of your social status and personal courage. The most popular game among the nobility was called faro, a precursor to modern baccarat that was pure chance with no skill involved whatsoever. Players would bet on which cards would be drawn from a deck, and the house always had a mathematical advantage. It was quite literally a system designed to separate aristocrats from their money as efficiently as possible. And yet, night after night, the most intelligent and educated people in France would sit down at faro tables and lose fortunes with almost ritualistic consistency. But here's where the story gets really dark. The French nobles weren't just gambling with their own money. Most of them were gambling with money they had borrowed against their future inheritance, money they had stolen from their estate revenues, and in some cases, money they had embezzled from government positions. The Marquis de Danjou, who kept meticulous records of court gambling, documented losses that would translate to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's currency. Losses sustained by people whose actual annual income couldn't have supported such extravagance for even a few months. The psychological dynamics of this gambling epidemic were fascinating and terrifying. At Versailles, your willingness to bet large amounts without visible emotion was seen as a sign of noble breeding and moral courage. Showing concern about money, even when you were losing your family's entire fortune, was considered deeply vulgar and socially unacceptable. This created a culture where financial ruin was not just tolerated but actually admired, as long as you ruined yourself with sufficient style and grace. The Duc de Richelieu, grandnephew of the famous cardinal, perfectly embodied this twisted logic. In a single evening in 1692, he lost what modern economists calculate would be equivalent to about $50 million today. When his wife learned of the loss and began weeping, Richelieu reportedly told her, "Madam, a gentleman never counts the cost of his pleasures." 3 months later, they lost their family chateau to creditors, but Richelieu continued gambling as if nothing had happened, borrowing money at increasingly desperate terms just to maintain his place at the tables. The most tragic example was probably the Count de Gramont, who'd already learned not to win too often against the king. Gramont became so addicted to gambling that he sold off his family's art collection, including paintings that had been in his family for over 2 centuries, just to fund his gaming habit. His wife, the beautiful and intelligent Elizabeth Hamilton, watched helplessly as her husband systematically destroyed their children's inheritance, one card game at a time. But Gramont's story illustrates something even more disturbing about the gambling culture at Versailles. It wasn't just about money. For many nobles, gambling had become a form of emotional regulation, a way to feel alive and important in a court system that had reduced them to decorative figures in the king's elaborate performance. The Duc de Saint-Simon, our reliable court chronicler, observed that many gentlemen seemed to prefer the agony of losing at cards to the boredom of winning at life. The women of Versailles were just as caught up in this madness, perhaps even more so. The Duchess de Polignac famously lost her entire dowry in a single night of playing basset, another popular card game. When her husband discovered what had happened, she convinced him that the loss was actually a form of investment, arguing that their social status required them to gamble at high stakes to maintain their position at court. It was circular logic at its most destructive. They had to gamble to maintain their status, but gambling was destroying the wealth that gave them status in the first place. The scale of the losses becomes even more shocking when you consider the economic context. While French nobles were losing fortunes at card tables, the common people of France were struggling with food shortages, tax burdens, and economic hardship. The money being thrown away nightly at Versailles could have funded hospitals, schools, roads, and other infrastructure that would have improved the lives of millions of French citizens. Instead, it was disappearing into the pockets of professional gamblers and card-sharp operators who'd figured out how to manipulate the games. And yes, there were professional cheaters working the rooms at Versailles. The Chevalier de Maison was eventually exposed as having marked cards, weighted dice, and an elaborate system of signals with accomplices who would help him fleece unwary nobles. The shocking thing wasn't that he was cheating. It was that when he was caught, many of his victims defended him, arguing that a true gentleman should be able to afford to lose even to a cheater. The twisted logic of aristocratic pride had made them complicit in their own financial destruction. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the gambling epidemic was how it affected the next generation. Young nobles, some barely 18 years old, would arrive at court and immediately be inducted into the gambling culture by older courtiers who saw them as fresh sources of money. The Duc de Nevers wrote in his memoirs about watching teenage boys lose their entire family inheritance in their first week at Versailles, then spend the rest of their time at court desperately trying to recoup their losses through increasingly risky bets. The human cost of this epidemic was staggering. Contemporary records show that between 1680 and 1700, at least 47 noble families declared bankruptcy directly due to gambling losses. dozens of aristocrats committed suicide rather than face the shame of financial ruin, and countless others lived in a state of constant anxiety, maintaining elaborate facades of wealth while secretly drowning in debt that could never be repaid. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these gamblers understood exactly what was happening to them. The Marquise de Maintenon, who would later become Louis XIV's secret wife, wrote privately about watching intelligent, educated people systematically destroy themselves. They know they're ruining their families, they know they're setting terrible examples for their children, they know they're contributing to the decay of our society, and yet they cannot stop. It is as if they are under a spell of their own making. The irony is almost painful to contemplate. These were the descendants of medieval knights, of men who had conquered territories and built empires through courage and strategic thinking. Now their descendants were conquering nothing and building nothing, instead sitting around tables night after night, letting chance determine their fate while their wealth flowed steadily into the hands of professional gamblers and the royal treasury that collected taxes from their losses. By the 1690s, the gambling epidemic had become so severe that it was affecting France's ability to function as a government. So many nobles were financially ruined that they couldn't afford to maintain their traditional roles as military officers, regional administrators, and diplomatic representatives. The aristocratic class that was supposed to be the backbone of French society had essentially gambled itself into irrelevance. And here's the truly chilling part. Nobody in authority seemed capable of stopping it, because the king himself was addicted to the same games that were destroying his nobility. Louis XIV couldn't condemn gambling without condemning himself, and he couldn't regulate the games without admitting that he had lost control of his own court. The Sun King had created a culture of excess that had grown beyond his ability to manage, and now that culture was consuming the very people he depended on to maintain his power. But while the French nobility was busy destroying itself one card game at a time, there was another form of pleasure at Versailles that was proving equally destructive and far more scandalous. Because in a court where everything was about appearances and performance, the most dangerous game wasn't played with cards and dice. It was played with hearts and minds and bodies, and the stakes were nothing less than the soul of French civilization itself. In the shadow of all that gambling madness, something far more dangerous was taking root at Versailles. A game where the stakes weren't just money or social status, but the very foundations of political power itself. Because when you create a society where pleasure is the ultimate currency, seduction inevitably becomes the most potent weapon of all, and the French aristocracy had turned the art of romantic manipulation into a science so sophisticated that it would make modern political strategists look like amateurs. Here's what's truly shocking. By the 1680s, nearly every major political decision made by Louis XIV could be traced back to the influence of someone he was either sleeping with, someone who wanted to sleep with him, or someone who was using romantic relationships to manipulate the people around him. Love hadn't just become political at Versailles. It had become the primary mechanism through which the entire French government actually operated. Let me give you an example that perfectly illustrates how twisted this system had become. In 1683, France was negotiating a crucial trade agreement with England that could have prevented the war that would eventually bankrupt both nations. The French ambassador to England was the Duc de Barillon, a competent diplomat who understood the economic benefits of the proposed treaty. But back at Versailles, the Countess de Soissons, the same woman we mentioned earlier in connection with the poison affair, was conducting a passionate affair with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, the Countess had invested heavily in several privateering operations that made money by attacking English merchant ships. A peace treaty with England would end her profitable little war business. So she used her romantic influence over the foreign minister to convince him that the proposed treaty was somehow beneath French dignity, Within a week, she had managed to sabotage months of delicate negotiations, ultimately contributing to a war that would cost both countries millions of lives and unimaginable wealth, all because she didn't want to lose her personal income from piracy. But the Countess de Soissons was hardly unique. The entire court system had evolved into an elaborate network of romantic relationships that served as channels for political influence. The beauty was that it was almost impossible to prove or prosecute. How do you charge someone with treason for having a conversation in bed? How do you regulate pillow talk between consenting adults? The French aristocracy had discovered the perfect loophole in the system of absolute monarchy. The sophistication of these romantic conspiracies was breathtaking. Take the case of the Duchess de Fontanges, not the same woman who died mysteriously, but her cousin, who inherited both the title and a talent for strategic seduction. When she discovered that Louis XIV was considering appointing a new minister of war who would have reduced military spending, she orchestrated what can only be described as a romantic pincer movement. First, she seduced the proposed minister's son, a young man barely 20 years old who was desperately trying to make his mark at court. Through pillow talk, she learned about his father's specific plans for military reform. Then, she began a simultaneous affair with one of Louis XIV's most trusted military advisors, using the intelligence she'd gathered from the son to convince the advisor that the proposed minister was planning to betray the king's military strategy to foreign powers. The result? The proposed minister was not only denied the appointment, but was actually exiled from court under suspicion of treason. His son, discovering how he had been manipulated, challenged the military advisor to a duel and was killed. And the Duchess de Fontanges? She received a substantial reward from the military contractors who would have lost money under the proposed reforms. 3 lives destroyed, a crucial government position filled with a less competent candidate, and all of it accomplished through the strategic deployment of romantic affection. What made these romantic conspiracies even more effective was that they tapped into something deeper than just physical attraction. The courtiers at Versailles were incredibly lonely people, despite being surrounded by hundreds of other nobles. The constant performance, the inability to show genuine emotions, the paranoia about social position, all of this created a deep hunger for authentic human connection. And skilled manipulators learned to exploit that hunger ruthlessly. The Marquise de Brinvilliers, another figure connected to our poison network, was perhaps the most skilled practitioner of what we might call emotional warfare. She didn't just seduce men for political gain. She made them fall genuinely in love with her, then used that love as a weapon. Her method was to identify powerful men who seemed emotionally isolated, often men whose wives had married them for political reasons and felt no real affection for them. She would begin by offering genuine sympathy and understanding, listening to their complaints about court life, their fears about political enemies, their frustrations with family obligations. Slowly, over months, she would become the one person in their lives who seemed to truly care about them as individuals rather than as political assets. And once she'd established that emotional dependency, she would begin making small requests. Could he mention her brother's name to the king? Could he review a petition from her cousin? Could he delay a particular policy decision until she had time to consult with her financial advisors? The requests seemed innocent individually, but collectively they allowed her to manipulate French domestic and foreign policy for nearly a decade. Her romantic relationships gave her advanced knowledge of military campaigns, tax policy changes, diplomatic negotiations, and court appointments. She used this information to engage in what we would today recognize as sophisticated insider trading, making investments and arranging business deals that earned her a fortune, while giving her even more resources to expand her network of romantic influence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system was how it corrupted the very concept of love itself. At Versailles, genuine romantic affection became almost impossible to distinguish from political calculation. When the young Duc de Chartres fell in love with Mademoiselle de Blois, one of Louis XIV's acknowledged daughters, was it real love, or was he attracted to the political advantages that marriage into the royal family would bring? When she accepted his proposal, was it because she cared for him, or because she wanted to escape the complex web of court politics that surrounded her as a royal bastard? The answer, in most cases, was probably both, and that's what made the situation so tragic. These were human beings with genuine emotions and real needs for connection, but they lived in a system that made it almost impossible to separate authentic feeling from strategic advantage. Love became just another form of currency in the marketplace of power, and the exchange rate was always fluctuating based on political circumstances. The psychological toll of this system was enormous. The Duc de Saint-Simon recorded numerous instances of what we would today recognize as emotional breakdowns among courtiers who had become trapped in romantic relationships that served political purposes but provided no genuine satisfaction. The Countess de Mailly wrote in her private diary about feeling like an actress who's been performing the same role for so long that she can no longer remember who she was before the performance began. Even more heartbreaking were the stories of young people who arrived at court with genuine capacity for love and slowly had it systematically corrupted by the demands of political survival. The Marquis de Lauzun wrote about watching innocent young women transform themselves into calculating seductresses because that was the only path to security and influence in our world. The system also created a strange form of sexual economy where physical attractiveness became a measurable political asset. Beautiful women and handsome men could quite literally convert their looks into political influence, wealth, and social position. But this meant that aging became not just a personal challenge but a political crisis. As their physical appeal faded, their political power evaporated as well. This dynamic explains much of the desperation we saw earlier in Madame de Montespan's turn toward black magic and poison. When romantic appeal was your primary source of political power, losing that appeal meant losing everything that gave your life meaning and security. The pressure to maintain physical attractiveness and sexual allure wasn't just vanity. It was a matter of political survival. The long-term consequences of this romantic political system were devastating for French society. Marriage became almost entirely strategic, with love relegated to extramarital affairs that were themselves often politically motivated. Children grew up in homes where their parents' relationships were based on calculation rather than affection, and the entire aristocratic class became emotionally stunted, capable of performing intimacy, but often incapable of experiencing it genuinely. But if romantic manipulation was the weapon of choice for most courtiers, there were others at Versailles who had discovered even darker tools for maintaining their power and position. Because in a world where pleasure had become the highest value, some people inevitably began exploring pleasures so forbidden, so dangerous, that they required absolute secrecy and complete loyalty from everyone involved. Deep beneath the glittering surface of Versailles, in chambers that most courtiers never knew existed, some of the most powerful people in France were gathering for activities so secret and so scandalous that discovery would have meant not just social ruin, but quite possibly execution. Because when you've exhausted every conventional pleasure that unlimited wealth and power can provide, the human appetite begins searching for something more forbidden. And what some members of the French aristocracy found in those hidden rooms would challenge everything their deeply Catholic society claimed to believe about morality, religion, and the very nature of good and evil. Let me start with something that sounds almost innocent compared to what's coming: the Society of the Golden Chalice. On the surface, this was simply an exclusive dining club for the most elite members of Louis XIV's court. Members included several dukes, a handful of the king's own cousins, 2 bishops, and at least 3 women who held major positions in the queen's household. They met once a month in a private mansion in Paris, ostensibly to enjoy fine food and intellectual conversation away from the rigid protocols of Versailles. But what actually happened at these gatherings would have horrified even the most worldly courtiers. The society had begun as a way for powerful Catholics to explore philosophical questions about faith and morality in a private setting. However, by the early 1680s, it had evolved into something far more dangerous, a group that was systematically experimenting with inversions of Catholic ritual, creating what they called philosophical explorations of spiritual boundaries. The records that survived, discovered hidden in a secret compartment during renovations of the mansion in 1891, reveal that society members were conducting elaborate mock religious ceremonies where sacred Catholic rituals were performed in reverse or with deliberate blasphemous modifications. They would hold midnight masses where wine was replaced with blood drawn from the participants themselves, where prayers were recited backwards, and where consecrated hosts stolen from actual churches were used in ways that I honestly can't describe in detail, even in a bedtime story. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. These weren't ignorant peasants playing with folk magic. These were some of the most educated people in Europe, individuals who had been trained in theology, philosophy, and natural science. They understood exactly what they were doing and why it was considered spiritually dangerous. That was, in fact, the entire point. They had become so jaded by conventional pleasure that they were seeking the ultimate thrill, the deliberate violation of their society's most sacred taboos. The Duc de Vendôme, Louis XIV's own nephew, wrote in a coded diary that was eventually deciphered in the 1960s, "We have tasted every pleasure that God permits and found them insufficient. Now we explore what he forbids, not from hatred of the divine, but from an insatiable hunger for experiences that penetrate to the very core of existence." The psychological profile that emerges from these records is both fascinating and terrifying. These were people who had been given everything human society could offer: unlimited wealth, absolute power over other human beings, the finest art, music, food, and entertainment that civilization could produce. And yet they were profoundly unsatisfied, constantly searching for something that would make them feel truly alive rather than merely entertained. The Society of the Golden Chalice represented just one thread in a much larger tapestry of secret organizations that had formed within the French aristocracy. There was also the Order of the Sublime Rose, whose members engaged in what they called philosophical investigations of human nature that involved elaborate psychological manipulation experiments on unwitting subjects from the lower classes. They would, for example, convince peasant families that one of their children had been chosen by God for special religious training, then subject the child to carefully designed psychological conditioning to see how completely they could reshape someone's personality and beliefs. Even more disturbing was the Circle of Eternal Midnight, whose membership included some of the most powerful women at Versailles. This group had become obsessed with what they called the exploration of ultimate experiences, situations designed to produce the most intense possible human emotions and sensations. Their activities included staged scenarios of betrayal, abandonment, and terror inflicted on people who'd been carefully selected for their psychological vulnerability. The Circle's most infamous project involved the systematic psychological destruction of a young nobleman who had committed the crime of publicly criticizing one of their members. Over the course of 18 months, they orchestrated a campaign that destroyed his reputation, his family relationships, his financial security, and his romantic prospects. But their goal wasn't simply revenge. It was to study how a human being responds to complete social annihilation. They documented every stage of his psychological breakdown with the detached curiosity of scientists studying a laboratory specimen. What made these secret societies particularly dangerous was that their members held positions of real authority within French society. The Bishop of Metz, who was involved with the Golden Chalice, was responsible for the spiritual guidance of hundreds of thousands of Catholics. The Duchess de Nemours, a leading figure in the Circle of Eternal Midnight, was one of the Queen's closest advisors and had significant influence over court appointments. These people weren't operating on the margins of society. They were society, at least the part of society that held the most power. But perhaps the most chilling organisation was one that didn't even have a formal name. It was simply referred to in the documents as the Gathering. This group consisted of approximately 20 of the highest-ranking nobles in France, and their focus was what they called the systematic violation of natural law. They had become convinced that conventional morality was simply a form of social control designed to keep ordinary people obedient, and that truly superior individuals had both the right and the obligation to transcend all traditional ethical boundaries. The Gathering's experiments included elaborate schemes to manipulate entire communities, creating artificial famines in certain regions to study how social order breaks down under extreme stress. They would use their political influence to redirect grain shipments away from specific towns, then send observers to document how the population responded to starvation. The data they collected was detailed and methodical. They recorded how quickly social hierarchies collapsed, which types of people became leaders during crisis periods, and what forms of violence emerged when civil authority broke down. But their most ambitious project was what they called the creation of artificial destiny. Gathering members would select individual families from the middle class and then use their vast resources and political connections to systematically manipulate every aspect of those families' lives over multiple generations. They would arrange marriages, influence career opportunities, create financial crises or windfalls, and even orchestrate seemingly random encounters, all to see how completely they could control the trajectory of other people's lives without those people ever realizing they were being manipulated. The psychological documents that survived from the Gathering's activities read like something out of a dystopian science fiction novel. They had developed detailed theories about human nature, social organization, and historical development that were centuries ahead of their time in their sophistication, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were systematic experiments designed to test hypotheses about the fundamental nature of human society. What's perhaps most disturbing is that these secret societies weren't operating in isolation from each other. There was significant overlap in membership, and they appeared to be coordinating their activities as part of some larger philosophical project. The evidence suggests that by the mid-1680s, a substantial portion of the French ruling class had essentially decided that conventional morality was a constraint they were no longer willing to accept. The Duc de Saint-Simon, our reliable chronicler of court life, seems to have known something about these activities, though he was careful never to write about them directly. In one of his most cryptic passages he noted, "There are certain forms of knowledge that circulate among the highest ranks of our society. Knowledge that would horrify those of more conventional understanding. I pray that future generations will judge us not too harshly for what we have permitted ourselves to become in our pursuit of ultimate experience." The truly tragic aspect of these secret societies was that they represented the logical endpoint of the pleasure-seeking culture that Louis XIV had created at Versailles. When you teach people that their desires are the highest law, When you create a society where conventional moral restraints are seen as obstacles to personal fulfillment, you inevitably create conditions where some people will push those ideas to their ultimate horrifying conclusions. And the most frightening part of all, while these secret societies were conducting their underground experiments in moral transgression, the official court life at Versailles continued exactly as before. The same elaborate ceremonies, the same polite conversations, the same carefully choreographed displays of royal magnificence. Most courtiers had no idea that some of their neighbours were participating in activities that would have shocked even the most hardened criminals of their time. But all of this secret experimentation, all of this hidden moral corruption, was creating economic pressures that would soon become impossible to ignore. Because when your ruling class is spending their time on elaborate psychological experiments instead of governing effectively, when they're more interested in pushing moral boundaries than in maintaining economic stability, the entire system begins to develop cracks that will eventually bring everything crashing down. While the French aristocracy was busy exploring the darkest corners of human experience, they were simultaneously engaging in a form of economic suicide so spectacular that it would make modern financial crises look like minor accounting errors. Here's the mind-blowing truth. The pleasure-seeking culture of Versailles didn't just corrupt French society morally, it literally bankrupted the richest empire in Europe and set the stage for one of the most violent revolutions in human history. And the numbers that survive in the royal treasury records are so shocking that economists still study them as an example of how quickly unlimited excess can destroy even the most powerful nations on earth. Let me put this in perspective for you. In 1661, when Louis XIV took personal control of the French government, France was the wealthiest nation in Europe. The royal treasury contained enough gold and silver to fund government operations for approximately 7 years without collecting a single tax. French trade dominated European commerce. French armies were the most feared military force on the continent, and French culture was admired and imitated from London to Moscow. By 1715, when Louis XIV died, France was technically bankrupt. Its people were starving, and the foundations had been laid for the social explosion that would eventually destroy the monarchy entirely. What happened in those 54 years? Versailles happened, and the scale of the financial devastation is almost impossible to comprehend. The annual cost of operating Versailles was approximately 25% of France's total national budget. To put that in modern terms, imagine if the United States government spent about $1 trillion every year just on the White House and its entertainment expenses. But even that comparison doesn't capture the full absurdity, because the US economy is enormous and diversified. The French economy in the 17th century was much more fragile, based primarily on agriculture and dependent on weather patterns, harvest success, and the physical health of the peasant workforce. The detailed expense records that survived, discovered in the 1970s in a sealed vault beneath the Treasury building, reveal spending patterns that would be comical if they weren't so tragic. In 1685, Louis XIV spent more money on fireworks for a single celebration than the entire annual budget for road maintenance throughout France. The result? While courtiers enjoyed spectacular pyrotechnic displays, French roads became so poorly maintained that travel between major cities became dangerous and unreliable, hampering trade and economic development. But the fireworks were just the beginning. The king's personal wardrobe budget for 1689 exceeded the total amount France spent on public education throughout the entire kingdom. While Louis XIV was commissioning diamond-encrusted buttons for his ceremonial jackets, French children were growing up illiterate because there was no money to pay teachers or build schools in rural areas. The most shocking example was probably the apartment parties, weekly entertainment events that Louis XIV hosted every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday at Versailles. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were elaborate theatrical productions featuring professional musicians, dancers, actors, and elaborate theme decorations that were completely rebuilt for each event. The average cost per party was equivalent to about $15 million in today's money. Think about that for a moment. 3 times a week, every week, for decades, Louis XIV was essentially hosting Super Bowl halftime shows for an audience of a few hundred people. The annual cost of these parties alone could have funded the construction of universities, hospitals, or infrastructure projects that would have benefited millions of French citizens. Instead, it was all spent on temporary entertainment that lasted a few hours and was then discarded. But the real economic damage wasn't just from the royal spending, it was from how that spending distorted the entire French economy. Because when the king and his court were spending money at such astronomical rates, it created artificial demand for luxury goods that drew resources away from productive economic activities. French artisans stopped making practical items like farming tools, household goods, and commercial equipment because they could make much more money creating decorative objects for Versailles. The silk industry is a perfect example. By 1690, over 60% of French silk production was dedicated to creating elaborate tapestries, curtains, and clothing for the court. Meanwhile, French merchants were importing basic textiles from other countries because their own textile workers were too busy making luxury items to produce the everyday fabrics that ordinary people needed. It was economic insanity. France was exporting its productive capacity to create objects of pure vanity while importing the practical goods that its people actually needed to survive. The financial records also reveal something even more disturbing: the systematic exploitation of the French tax system to fund court pleasures. Louis XIV's finance ministers developed increasingly creative ways to squeeze money out of the French population, inventing new taxes on everything from windows to playing cards to the salt that people needed to preserve food. But instead of using this tax revenue for public benefit, it was flowing directly into the endless appetite of Versailles. The salt tax, called the gabelle, is particularly tragic. Salt was essential for food preservation in an era before refrigeration, especially for poor families who needed to make their food last through winter months. The government monopolized salt production and forced people to buy it at artificially inflated prices, with the excess revenue going to fund court entertainments. Essentially, the monarchy was taxing survival itself to pay for parties, but perhaps the most damaging aspect of the Versailles economy was how it created a culture of financial irresponsibility that infected the entire aristocratic class. Because the king was spending money recklessly, courtiers felt pressure to match his level of extravagance to maintain their social status. This created a cascade effect where noble families throughout France were borrowing money they couldn't repay to fund lifestyles they couldn't afford. The Marquis de Louvois, Louis XIV's war minister, left behind personal financial records that perfectly illustrate this dynamic. Despite holding one of the most powerful positions in the French government, Louvois was consistently spending 300% of his official salary to maintain his position at court. He was borrowing money from Italian banks at interest rates that would be considered predatory by modern standards, using his government position as collateral for personal loans that he had no realistic hope of ever repaying. And Louvois wasn't unusual. He was typical. A survey of noble family finances conducted by French historians in the 1980s found that by 1700, approximately 80% of French aristocratic families were carrying debt loads that exceeded their annual income by more than 200%. They were essentially living in a fantasy economy where everyone pretended to have money that didn't actually exist. This financial house of cards was made even more precarious by the way wealth was being transferred out of France entirely. Because French nobles were competing to display the most exotic luxuries, they were importing massive quantities of goods from other countries: Chinese porcelain, Indian spices, Ottoman silks, Brazilian sugar, Caribbean tobacco. French gold and silver were flowing out of the country to pay for foreign luxury goods, while French productive capacity was being wasted on creating domestic luxury goods that served no practical purpose. The trade balance numbers are staggering. In 1670, France had a positive trade balance. It was exporting more than it imported and accumulating wealth. By 1700, France had one of the worst trade deficits in Europe, hemorrhaging precious metals to pay for the imported luxuries that had become essential to court life. The country was literally trading away its economic foundation for temporary pleasures. But the most tragic aspect of this economic catastrophe was its human cost. While the court at Versailles was consuming resources at an unprecedented rate, ordinary French people were experiencing increasing poverty and hardship. Contemporary records from rural parishes show that malnutrition was becoming widespread in the French countryside, not because the land couldn't produce enough food, but because the economic system was so distorted that farmers couldn't afford to keep the food they grew. The Abbé de Choisy, who travelled extensively throughout France during this period, wrote, "It is a peculiar form of madness that has seized our nation. In the countryside, I have seen families sharing single meals among 6 or 7 people, while 30 miles away at Versailles, I have watched courtiers throw away food that could have fed entire villages, simply because it was no longer fashionable to eat yesterday's delicacies." By the 1690s, the economic pressure was creating social tensions that even the isolated courtiers at Versailles could no longer ignore. But instead of addressing the fundamental problems with their economic system, the aristocracy chose to double down on their pleasure-seeking lifestyle, convinced that somehow their privileges and pleasures were worth any price the rest of society might pay. And among the figures who embodied this attitude most completely was a young Austrian princess who would soon arrive at Versailles, bringing with her a talent for excess that would make even the jaded French court gasp in amazement, and whose name would eventually become synonymous with everything that was wrong with aristocratic privilege. Imagine, if you will, arriving at what you think is the most decadent court in the world, only to discover that your appetite for pleasure makes even the most jaded French courtiers look like amateur hour. That's exactly what happened when 14-year-old Marie Antoinette stepped out of her diamond-encrusted carriage at Versailles in 1770, took one look around at all the splendour that had bankrupted an empire, and essentially said, "Hold my champagne." What followed was a masterclass in how to turn extravagance into an art form so refined, so breathtakingly excessive, that it would make Louis XIV himself seem positively restrained by comparison. Here's what you need to understand about Marie Antoinette. She didn't arrive at Versailles intending to become a symbol of aristocratic excess. She was, by all accounts, a sweet-natured, somewhat naive teenage girl who'd been raised in the relatively informal Austrian court where people actually talk to each other like human beings. But when you take someone with a natural talent for spending money and drop them into a system that equates luxury with virtue, the results can be spectacular in all the worst ways. Marie Antoinette's first year at Versailles was relatively modest by the standards we've been discussing. Her personal expenses for 1771 were approximately equivalent to $20 million in today's money, which sounds like a lot until you remember that this was considered quite reasonable for a member of the royal family. The problem was that Marie Antoinette was a quick learner, and what she learned was that at Versailles, there was literally no upper limit to what you could spend if you were creative enough about it. By 1775, just 5 years after her arrival, Marie Antoinette's annual personal expenses had increased to the equivalent of about $60 million. But it wasn't just the amount she was spending. It was how she was spending it that shocked even veteran courtiers who thought they had seen everything. Marie Antoinette had essentially weaponized consumption, turning shopping into a form of artistic expression that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible to purchase. Take her approach to fashion, for example. The average French noblewoman might own 50 to 100 dresses. Marie Antoinette owned over 200 dresses at any given time, with new ones being added almost daily. But even that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that she rarely wore any dress more than once or twice. Her wardrobe was essentially a disposable luxury, with gowns worth thousands of dollars being discarded after a single wearing because she decided they were no longer interesting. But Marie Antoinette's true genius lay in her ability to make luxury itself more luxurious. She didn't just want expensive things, she wanted expensive things that were so unnecessarily elaborate that they became almost surreal. Her shoe collection, for instance, included pairs that were literally encrusted with diamonds and pearls, making them too heavy to walk in comfortably. She owned shoes that cost more than most French families earned in a decade, and she wore them to walk around her private apartments where no one except her personal servants would ever see them. The really mind-bending part was her approach to food. Marie Antoinette didn't just want elaborate meals, she wanted meals that were essentially edible theatre productions. She would commission entire banquets where every dish was designed to look like something else. She had dinners where the soup was served in bowls made of ice that gradually melted during the meal, where the bread was sculpted to look like famous artworks, and where the desserts were mechanical creations that moved and played music while you ate them. One particularly notorious dinner party featured a 7-course meal where every dish was designed to look like a different precious stone. The soup resembled liquid emeralds, the fish course was prepared to look like sapphires, and the dessert was a confection that perfectly mimicked a diamond necklace, which incidentally cost more to create than the actual diamond necklace it was imitating. The entire meal took 6 months to plan and employed over 40 specialized artisans just to create food that would be consumed in a single evening. But Marie Antoinette's most spectacular excess was probably her approach to interior decoration. Not content with the already magnificent rooms at Versailles, she began a series of renovation projects that redefined what it meant to live in luxury. Her private apartments were redecorated 17 times during her 23 years at Versailles, with each renovation being more elaborate and expensive than the last. The final renovation, completed in 1788, included walls covered in silk that had been hand-painted with gold leaf, furniture made from woods that had been imported from 6 different continents, and a ceiling fresco that required the services of the most expensive artists in Europe for over 2 years. The total cost of this single-room renovation was equivalent to approximately $100 million in today's money, more than many countries spent on their entire royal palaces. But here's where Marie Antoinette's story becomes truly fascinating and a little tragic. She seemed to understand that her spending was excessive, and yet she couldn't stop herself. Contemporary accounts describe her as being almost compulsively driven to find new ways to spend money, as if she were trying to fill some emotional void through the act of consumption itself. The Austrian ambassador, Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, wrote to Marie Antoinette's mother expressing concern about what he called the Queen's melancholy relationship with material objects. He observed that she seemed to derive pleasure not from owning beautiful things, but from the process of acquiring them, and that once she possessed something, she quickly lost interest and moved on to pursuing something even more elaborate and expensive. This psychological dynamic helps explain one of the most infamous aspects of Marie Antoinette's reputation, her gambling addiction. Unlike the courtiers we discussed earlier, who gambled for social and political reasons, Marie Antoinette seemed to gamble purely for the emotional intensity of risking enormous sums of money. She would bet amounts that could fund military campaigns on single hands of cards, apparently seeking the adrenaline rush that came from potentially losing or winning fortunes in a matter of minutes. The Duchess de Polignac, one of Marie Antoinette's closest friends, recorded several instances where the Queen lost the equivalent of millions of dollars in single gaming sessions, then immediately borrowed more money to continue playing. When asked why she took such enormous risks, Marie Antoinette reportedly replied, "When you can have anything you want, the only pleasure left is in risking everything you have." But perhaps the most revealing insight into Marie Antoinette's psychology comes from her creation of the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace within the grounds of Versailles that she designed as her personal retreat. On the surface, the Petit Trianon seems almost modest compared to the main palace. It's smaller, more intimate, decorated in a simpler style that emphasized natural beauty rather than overwhelming grandeur. But even Marie Antoinette's attempt at simplicity was spectacularly expensive. The simple gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon required the labour of over 500 gardeners working year-round to maintain the appearance of natural wilderness. The rustic village that she built for her own amusement featured cottages that were designed to look like peasant homes, but were actually equipped with running water, central heating, and luxury amenities that most real peasants couldn't have imagined. The village included a working farm where Marie Antoinette and her friends could play at being farmers, except the animals were specially bred for beauty rather than productivity. The tools were made of silver and decorated with precious stones, and the peasant costumes they wore while pretending to milk cows were made of silk, and cost more than actual peasants earned in their entire lifetimes. The psychological disconnect revealed by the Petit Trianon is almost heartbreaking. Here was a woman who seemed to have some understanding that the lifestyle at Versailles was artificial and unsatisfying, who genuinely longed for something more authentic and meaningful. But she was so completely removed from reality that her attempt to experience simple life required the creation of an elaborate fantasy that was even more expensive and artificial than the lifestyle she was trying to escape. The tragic irony is that while Marie Antoinette was spending unprecedented amounts of money trying to create authentic experiences, actual French people were experiencing very real hardship that was partly caused by the economic drain of supporting her lifestyle. The contrast became so stark that even some courtiers began to feel uncomfortable with the level of excess they were witnessing. The Duc de Creux wrote in his memoirs, "I have watched the Queen spend in a single afternoon what would provide comfortable lives for 100 families, and then express boredom because she cannot think of anything else to purchase. It is a form of spiritual sickness that seems to affect those who've been given too much too easily." But Marie Antoinette's spending was just the most visible symptom of a broader cultural problem that was reaching a crisis point. Because while the Queen was creating her fantasy villages and commissioning edible jewellery, the real world was becoming increasingly unstable, and the gap between the aristocratic bubble and harsh reality was growing so wide that it could no longer be ignored. And in the streets of Paris, among people who were struggling to afford bread while watching their Queen play dress-up in diamond-encrusted shoes, a very different kind of passion was beginning to stir. A passion that would soon prove far more powerful and far more dangerous than any of the forbidden pleasures that had consumed the attention of the French aristocracy for so many decades. Behind the magnificent facade of heterosexual romance and strategic marriages that dominated public life at Versailles, there existed a hidden world of same-sex relationships that were simultaneously the worst-kept secret and the most dangerous truth in French society. What makes this story particularly fascinating and heartbreaking is how these relationships flourished in plain sight while remaining officially invisible, creating a complex web of love, power, and survival that reveals just how deeply the pursuit of forbidden pleasure had penetrated every aspect of aristocratic life. Let me introduce you to Philippe d'Orléans, known simply as Monsieur, Louis XIV's younger brother and the second most powerful man in France. Monsieur was flamboyantly, unapologetically, and very publicly interested in men, and somehow managed to navigate this identity in one of the most Catholic and theoretically conservative courts in Europe. His story reveals the fascinating contradictions and hypocrisies that made Versailles such a psychologically complex environment. Monsieur didn't just have male lovers, he had official male favourites who lived openly at court, received titles and pensions, and were treated by everyone as his de facto spouses in everything but name. His most famous relationship was with the Chevalier de Lorraine, a stunningly beautiful young nobleman who wielded enormous influence over French politics through his romantic connection to the king's brother. Contemporary observers noted that important government decisions were often delayed until the Chevalier had been consulted, and that foreign ambassadors would actually seek audiences with him rather than going through official diplomatic channels. But here's what's truly remarkable. While Monsieur's sexuality was completely open knowledge, it was also completely unmentionable. Court etiquette demanded that everyone pretend not to notice what was happening right in front of them. The result was a bizarre form of social theatre where the second most powerful man in France could live openly with his male lover, but referring to that relationship directly, even in private correspondence, could result in social exile or worse. This created a fascinating linguistic code that allowed people to discuss these relationships while maintaining plausible deniability. Letters from the period are filled with euphemisms like particular friendships, intimate confidences, and exclusive devotions. The Marquise de Sévigné, our sharp-eyed court observer, became particularly skilled at describing same-sex relationships in language that was completely clear to informed readers, but technically innocent enough to avoid official censure. But Monsieur was hardly unique. A careful reading of court records reveals a vast network of same-sex relationships among both male and female courtiers. The difference was that most people were more discreet about it than the king's brother, who had the luxury of royal protection for his personal choices. The women's side of this story is equally fascinating and considerably more dangerous. Same-sex relationships between women existed throughout the court, but they operated under even stricter codes of secrecy because women had far less social power to protect themselves if discovered. The typical pattern involved what were called romantic friendships, intense emotional and often physical relationships between women that were disguised as particularly close platonic bonds. The Duchess de Fontanges, not the various other women we've mentioned with that title, but another member of that prolific family, conducted a 20-year relationship with the Countess de Mailly that was so intense and exclusive that both women turned down multiple marriage proposals to maintain their partnership. They lived together, travelled together, shared finances, and even commissioned joint portraits that depicted them in poses that were typically reserved for married couples. Their relationship was an open secret at court, but it survived because they were both extraordinarily careful to maintain the fiction that they were simply unusually devoted friends. They would attend court functions accompanied by male escorts, engage in light flirtations with men to deflect suspicion, and even occasionally spread rumours about each other's romantic interests in specific men, all while sharing a bed every night for 2 decades. But the most complex and tragic figure in this hidden world was probably the Count de Vermandois, one of Louis XIV's illegitimate sons, who inherited his uncle Monsieur's sexual orientation, but none of his social protection. Vermandois fell deeply in love with a young cavalry officer named Henri de Massue, and their relationship became the source of one of the most heartbreaking scandals in Versailles history. Unlike his uncle, Vermandois tried to keep his relationship completely secret, understanding that as a potential heir to the throne, his sexuality could be used against him politically. He and Massue conducted their affair through an elaborate network of coded letters, secret meetings, and carefully arranged military assignments that would allow them to spend time together without arousing suspicion. The relationship worked for several years, but it was ultimately destroyed by the same forces of jealousy and political manipulation that affected heterosexual relationships at court. A rival officer, the Marquis de Dangeau, yes, the same man who documented the gambling losses, discovered evidence of the relationship and used it to blackmail Vermandois into supporting his own political schemes. When Vermandois finally refused to cooperate with Dangeau's demands, the Marquis arranged for compromising letters to be accidentally discovered by Louis XIV himself. The king's reaction was swift and brutal. Vermandois was stripped of his military command, exiled from court, and died under mysterious circumstances less than a year later. Massieu was sent to fight in the most dangerous military campaigns available, where he was killed in what was officially recorded as a heroic cavalry charge, but which witnesses described as a suicidal attack against overwhelming odds. The psychological toll of living with such intense secrecy was enormous for everyone involved in these relationships. The Duc de Saint-Simon, our reliable chronicler, wrote about the peculiar melancholy that seemed to affect certain courtiers, particularly those who were burdened with affections that could not be openly acknowledged. He observed that many of these individuals seemed to live in a state of constant anxiety, always aware that their personal happiness depended on maintaining perfect discretion about the most important relationships in their lives. But what's particularly fascinating is how these hidden relationships created their own elaborate social networks and support systems. Same-sex couples would often form alliances with other same-sex couples, creating informal family structures that provided emotional and sometimes financial support. These networks operated like secret societies within the larger court society, with their own codes of loyalty and mutual protection. The Chevalier de Maison, for example, maintained what amounted to a private salon where men who were attracted to other men could gather for conversation, entertainment, and socializing without the constant pressure of maintaining heterosexual appearances. These gatherings were disguised as intellectual discussion groups or artistic societies, but they functioned as safe spaces where people could relax and be authentic about their identities. Similar networks existed among women, often centered around the households of older noblewomen who had either never married or were widowed, and therefore had more freedom to organize their social lives around personal preference rather than family obligation. The Countess de Soissons, the same woman involved in the poison affair, maintained such a household where younger women could find mentorship, protection, and romantic opportunities within a carefully controlled environment. But these networks also created their own forms of drama and political intrigue. Romantic rivalries within same-sex relationships could be just as intense and destructive as those in heterosexual circles, and the added element of secrecy made everything more psychologically intense. When relationships ended badly, the potential for mutual destruction was enormous, since each partner possessed information that could ruin the other's reputation and social position. The Count de Bussy-Rabutin, himself involved in several same-sex relationships during his time at court, wrote in his private memoirs about the exquisite torture of conducting romantic relationships that had to remain invisible. We love with the same passion as other men, but we must express that love in whispers, celebrate our happiness in secret, and bear our heartbreaks in silence. It creates an intensity of feeling that I sometimes think burns more brightly because it must remain hidden. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this hidden world was how it affected people's ability to form lasting relationships. The constant pressure of secrecy, the fear of discovery, and the knowledge that their relationships had no legal or social protection made it difficult for couples to plan for the future or build stable lives together. Many relationships that might have lasted decades in a more accepting environment were destroyed by the stress of maintaining absolute discretion year after year. And yet, despite all these challenges, love found a way to flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. People risked everything, their fortunes, their reputations, their lives, for the chance to love authentically, even if that love had to remain forever hidden from the world around them. This hidden world of forbidden love was just one more thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of secret activities that was consuming the attention and energy of the French aristocracy. But while these romantic relationships were generally harmless to everyone except the people involved in them, the other secret activities we've been exploring were creating social and psychological pressures that would soon explode into the open, transforming not just individual lives but the entire structure of French society. What happens when an entire social class becomes so addicted to pleasure that they lose the ability to function in the real world? The French aristocracy was about to find out, and the psychological breakdown that resulted would be both fascinating and terrifying to witness. By the 1780s, decades of living in an artificial paradise had created a generation of nobles who were literally incapable of existing outside the bubble they had created for themselves. And when that bubble finally burst, the human cost would be devastating. Think about what we've discussed so far. Gambling addictions that destroyed family fortunes, romantic conspiracies that replaced genuine governance, secret societies that experimented with human cruelty, and spending habits that bankrupted an empire. Now imagine being a person whose entire identity, whose sense of self-worth, whose daily routine, and whose emotional stability all depended on maintaining access to these destructive pleasures. What happens to such a person when the system that enabled their lifestyle suddenly starts to collapse? The answer is that they don't adapt. They can't adapt. They become like addicts whose drug supply has been cut off, except their drug was an entire way of life, and there was no rehabilitation program for people who had forgotten how to exist without unlimited luxury and constant entertainment. The Marquis de Bouilly left behind one of the most brutally honest accounts of what this psychological dependency looked like from the inside. Writing in his private journal in 1787, he described feeling like a man who has been living in a beautiful dream for so long that waking life has become unbearable and incomprehensible. He wrote about experiencing panic attacks when faced with the prospect of living within his actual financial means, about feeling physically ill when forced to make practical decisions about money or property management. What's particularly heartbreaking about Bouilly's account is how he describes the complete erosion of basic life skills among his social class. He admits that at age 45, he had never in his life balanced his own accounts, never planned a budget, never made a decision about household expenses without consulting multiple servants and advisors. The aristocratic education system at Versailles had been so focused on teaching people how to navigate court politics and display wealth appropriately that it had completely failed to prepare them for the basic responsibilities of adult life. The psychological profiles that emerge from surviving letters and memoirs from this period read like textbook descriptions of what we would today recognize as severe addiction and codependency. The Duchess de Polignac, Marie Antoinette's closest friend, wrote about experiencing what she called the shaking sickness whenever she was forced to spend more than a few days away from Versailles. She described physical symptoms that included trembling hands, insomnia, loss of appetite, and an inability to concentrate on anything except her desire to return to court. But the most disturbing aspect of this psychological breakdown was how it affected people's relationships with reality itself. After decades of living in an environment where their every whim was catered to, where unpleasant facts were filtered out by servants and advisors, and where their comfort was the highest priority for everyone around them, many aristocrats had literally lost the ability to process information that contradicted their desires. The Count d'Artois, the future King Charles III, provides a perfect example of this reality distortion. In 1788, when presented with detailed financial reports showing that his personal spending had exceeded his income by over 400% for 3 consecutive years, his response was to commission an even more expensive renovation of his private apartments. When his financial advisors explained that he was facing potential bankruptcy, he accused them of lying and had them dismissed from his service. He then hired new advisors with instructions to find ways to increase his spending allowance. This wasn't simple denial. It was a complete inability to process information that didn't fit with his self-image as someone who deserved unlimited luxury. He had become so psychologically dependent on his lifestyle that any threat to it was literally unthinkable. His mind simply rejected data that suggested he might need to change his behavior. The social dynamics that emerged as the aristocratic system began to break down were equally disturbing. Instead of banding together to address their common problems, the nobles turned on each other with a viciousness that shocked even contemporary observers. The same people who had socialized together for decades suddenly began engaging in elaborate schemes to destroy each other financially and socially. The salon of Madame de Pompadour, not the famous mistress of Louis XV but her niece, became a gathering place for what can only be described as psychological warfare among the aristocracy. Nobles would attend her parties specifically to spread false rumours about each other's financial situations, to sabotage each other's business deals, and to compete for access to increasingly scarce sources of credit and income. The Duchess de Chartres recorded several instances where longtime friends would pretend to offer financial assistance to each other, only to deliberately provide bad advice that would worsen their targets' financial situations. She described watching people she had known since childhood systematically destroy each other's reputations and prospects, apparently believing that if they could eliminate enough competition, there might be enough resources left for their own survival. But perhaps the most tragic casualties of this psychological breakdown were the children of the aristocracy. Young people who had been raised in this system of unlimited indulgence found themselves completely unprepared for a world where their desires might not be immediately satisfied. Many of them experienced what we would today recognize as severe mental health crises when confronted with the reality of their family's declining circumstances. The Marquise de Maintenon wrote about counselling several teenage nobles who'd become so depressed by the prospect of living less luxuriously that they were expressing suicidal thoughts. She described young people who had never been denied anything they wanted becoming completely despondent when told they might need to reduce their clothing allowances or give up their private tutors. One particularly heartbreaking case involved the young Duc de Nemours, who had been raised to believe that his happiness was the most important consideration in every family decision. When his father finally explained that their estate was bankrupt and that they would need to sell their Paris mansion, the 18-year-old Duke locked himself in his room for 6 weeks, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. When he finally emerged, he had apparently convinced himself that his family's financial problems were temporary and that their lifestyle would soon return to normal. The psychological damage wasn't limited to emotional or mental health issues. Many aristocrats began experiencing physical symptoms that their doctors couldn't explain, but that were clearly related to the stress of their changing circumstances. Contemporary medical records describe an epidemic of mysterious ailments among the nobility. Chronic fatigue, digestive problems, skin conditions, and what one court physician described as a wasting sickness that seems to affect only those who have lived too well for too long. But perhaps the most revealing insight into the psychological state of the French aristocracy comes from the letters they wrote to each other during this period. Instead of discussing practical solutions to their problems, their correspondence became increasingly focused on fantasy scenarios where their old lifestyle would somehow be restored. They wrote elaborate plans for new sources of income that had no basis in reality, schemes for regaining royal favour that ignored the political changes happening around them, and detailed descriptions of the parties they would throw and the luxuries they would purchase once their temporary difficulties were resolved. The Marquis de Condorcet, who was both a member of the aristocracy and a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, wrote with painful clarity about watching his social class retreat into collective delusion rather than face the necessity of fundamental change. He observed that many of his fellow nobles seemed to prefer living in fantasy rather than adapting to new circumstances, even when adaptation might have saved their fortunes and possibly their lives. This psychological breakdown had practical consequences that extended far beyond individual suffering. Because the aristocracy was still technically responsible for local governance, military leadership, and economic management throughout France, their inability to function effectively created a power vacuum that made the entire country increasingly unstable. Local administrators who had spent decades focused on court politics suddenly found themselves unable to address practical problems like crop failures, infrastructure maintenance, and tax collection. Military officers who had been more concerned with their uniforms than their tactical training discovered they couldn't effectively command troops in real combat situations. Economic managers who had been primarily focused on funding their own luxurious lifestyles proved incapable of developing policies that might address France's growing financial crisis. The result was a cascade of failures throughout French society that created exactly the kind of instability and resentment that would soon explode into revolution. But even as their world was collapsing around them, many aristocrats remained convinced that their problems were temporary, that their pleasures would soon be restored, and that the natural order of things would somehow reassert itself to preserve their privileged position. They had no idea that far from Versailles, in the streets and coffee houses of Paris, a very different group of people has been watching their decline with growing anger and determination, and that those people were about to demonstrate that there were some problems that couldn't be solved with luxury, charm, or royal favour. Nothing ignites revolutionary fury quite like the contrast between watching your children go hungry while your rulers throw parties that cost more than your entire neighbourhood will earn in a lifetime. And by the 1780s, that contrast had become so stark, so impossible to ignore, that it was only a matter of time before the rage of ordinary French people would explode into violence that would literally reshape the world. What's fascinating and terrifying is how the aristocracy's addiction to forbidden pleasures created the perfect storm of resentment that would ultimately destroy them. Here's a number that will make your blood boil. In 1788, the year before the French Revolution began, Marie Antoinette spent more money on a single dress, one dress, than the average French family earned in 15 years. That dress, encrusted with diamonds and pearls, was worn once to a court party and then stored in her wardrobe, never to be worn again. Meanwhile, bread riots were breaking out in Paris because ordinary people couldn't afford to feed their families. But it wasn't just the money. It was the flaunting of that money in the face of obvious suffering that pushed public anger past the breaking point. The French people weren't stupid. They understood that luxury and poverty could coexist in any society. What they couldn't tolerate was watching their rulers celebrate their own excess while remaining completely indifferent to the suffering that excess was causing. The spark that really ignited popular rage was something called the diamond necklace affair, a scandal so perfectly symbolic of aristocratic corruption that it reads like it was designed by a revolutionary propaganda committee. In 1784, a con artist named Jeanne de Valois convinced Cardinal de Rohan that Marie Antoinette wanted to secretly purchase an enormously expensive diamond necklace, but needed him to arrange the transaction discreetly. The necklace in question was worth approximately $50 million in today's money, enough to fund hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects that could have improved the lives of thousands of French families. But instead of being used for public benefit, this fortune was essentially stolen through an elaborate confidence scheme that revealed just how disconnected the aristocracy had become from basic common sense and reality. Here's what makes the story even more infuriating. Cardinal de Rohan, one of the highest-ranking religious officials in France, was so eager to gain favour with the Queen that he never bothered to verify whether she had actually requested the purchase. He was so blinded by his desire for access to royal pleasure and privilege that he handed over a fortune to criminals without taking even basic precautions to protect himself or the church's assets. When the scheme was exposed, the public reaction was volcanic. People who'd been struggling to afford bread were reading in newspapers about religious leaders casually losing fortunes on jewellery purchases for a queen who already owned more diamonds than most people could count. The symbolism was perfect and devastating. The Catholic Church, which preached about charity and helping the poor, was revealed to be complicit in the aristocracy's obsession with meaningless luxury. But the diamond necklace affair was just the most visible example of a pattern that had been developing for decades. French people had been watching their rulers prioritize pleasure over governance, personal indulgence over public welfare, and short-term gratification over long-term stability. And they had been keeping score. Contemporary pamphlets and newspapers from the period reveal a level of detailed knowledge about aristocratic spending that suggests ordinary people had been paying very close attention to what their social superiors were doing with the money that was supposed to be used for governing the country. They knew about Marie Antoinette's gambling debts, about the cost of court entertainments, about the elaborate renovation projects that consumed fortunes while infrastructure crumbled. More importantly, they understood the connection between aristocratic excess and their own hardships. When grain shipments were delayed because the government couldn't afford to maintain roads, people knew that the road maintenance budget had been diverted to pay for court parties. When schools closed because there was no money to pay teachers, parents knew that education funding had been redirected to support the lifestyles of people who contributed nothing productive to society. The psychological impact of this knowledge was devastating to the traditional relationship between rulers and ruled. For centuries, French people had accepted aristocratic privilege because they believed it came with corresponding obligations, that nobles enjoyed luxury in exchange for providing protection, justice, and effective governance. But by the 1780s it had become obvious that the aristocracy was taking all the benefits of their position while completely abandoning the responsibilities. The Marquis de Condorcet, writing just before the Revolution, captured this shift perfectly. The people have realised that we have become parasites rather than protectors, consumers rather than producers, entertainers rather than leaders. We've broken the social contract that justified our privileges, and now we face the consequences of that betrayal. But what really pushed popular anger over the edge was the discovery of just how extensive the hidden world of aristocratic corruption had become. As investigations into the diamond necklace affair expanded, they revealed connections to the poison network we discussed earlier, to secret societies engaged in bizarre experiments, and to financial schemes that had systematically looted the royal treasury for private gain. The French people learned that while they had been paying increasing taxes to support what they thought was the cost of government, much of that money had actually been funding activities that range from wasteful to immoral to outright criminal. They discovered that their sacrifices had been subsidizing not just luxury, but actual evil, poison plots, psychological torture experiments, and elaborate schemes to manipulate and exploit ordinary people for the entertainment of the bored aristocracy. The reaction was swift and brutal. By 1788, anti-aristocratic pamphlets were circulating throughout France. that contain detailed descriptions of specific nobles' crimes and excesses. These weren't vague accusations or general complaints about inequality. They were precise, well-documented catalogues of particular individuals' behaviour that read like criminal indictments. One pamphlet, titled The True Accounting of Versailles, listed specific amounts that individual courtiers had spent on gambling, clothing and entertainment, alongside calculations of how many families could have been fed or housed with the same money. Another publication, The Secret Lives of Our Rulers, contained detailed accounts of the psychological experiments and occult activities that had been conducted by aristocratic secret societies. The impact of these revelations on public opinion was explosive. French people weren't just angry about inequality anymore. They were disgusted by the moral corruption that inequality had enabled. They began to see the aristocracy not as fellow human beings who happened to be wealthier, but as fundamentally different creatures whose appetites and behaviours were so alien that coexistence was impossible. The language used in revolutionary pamphlets from this period reflects this dehumanization. Aristocrats were described as monsters, demons, and creatures whose pleasures require the suffering of others. The revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre wrote that the aristocracy had evolved into a separate species that feeds on human misery and grows stronger through the consumption of others' pain. This wasn't just rhetorical exaggeration. It reflected a genuine belief that decades of unlimited indulgence had transformed the French nobility into something no longer recognizably human. And once that psychological shift occurred, once ordinary people stopped seeing aristocrats as fellow citizens who deserved basic human consideration, violence became not just possible, but inevitable. The first riots began in the spring of 1789, and they were characterized by a level of fury that shocked even experienced observers of social unrest. When angry crowds attacked the mansions of particular nobles, they didn't just steal valuables or demand money. They systematically destroyed symbols of luxury and excess with a ritualistic intensity that suggested they were trying to eliminate something they saw as spiritually contaminating. The Marquis de Launay, who witnessed several of these early riots, wrote that the people attack our possessions with the fervour of religious crusaders destroying pagan idols. They seem to believe that luxury itself is a form of evil that must be purged from the world. He observed that crowds would spend hours carefully destroying expensive objects, smashing crystal, burning silk clothing, defacing paintings, with a thoroughness that went far beyond simple theft or vandalism. But the most ominous development was how quickly the revolutionary movement began to focus on specific individuals rather than general social changes. Lists of aristocrats marked for punishment began circulating in Paris, and these lists were based not just on wealth or political position, but on detailed knowledge of particular nobles' private behaviour and secret activities. The people had been watching, learning, and remembering everything. And now they were ready to settle accounts not just for economic exploitation, but for decades of moral corruption that had poisoned the very idea of legitimate authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be unlike anything Europe had ever experienced. Not just a political revolution, but a moral reckoning that would attempt to cleanse an entire society of what people had come to see as aristocratic contamination. And at the centre of this approaching storm, the aristocracy remained convinced that somehow, some way, their pleasures and privileges would be preserved, their lifestyle would continue, and their world of forbidden indulgences would survive whatever temporary unpleasantness might be headed their way. Even as Paris erupted in revolutionary fury and the very foundations of their world were crumbling beneath their feet, the aristocrats at Versailles continued to live as if nothing had changed, and their final parties were perhaps the most surreal and tragic spectacles in human history. Picture this. While angry mobs were literally sharpening guillotines in the streets of Paris, the French nobility was hosting elaborate masquerade balls where they dressed up as shepherds and milkmaids, playing at being the very people who were preparing to destroy them. The psychological disconnect was so complete, so breathtakingly profound, that it would be almost funny if it weren't so tragic. In the summer of 1789, as the revolution was gaining momentum and aristocratic mansions were being burned throughout France, Marie Antoinette hosted what she called a pastoral paradise party at the Petit Trianon. The theme required all guests to dress as idealized peasants and farmers, complete with carefully crafted rustic costumes that cost more money than actual peasants would see in their entire lifetimes. Contemporary accounts describe nobles stumbling around in diamond-encrusted wooden shoes, pretending to milk cows while wearing silk gowns designed to look like peasant dresses. The Duchesse de Polignac won a prize for most authentic farmer's costume, an outfit that included a rake made of gold and emeralds. Meanwhile, actual farmers 20 miles away were joining revolutionary militias and making detailed plans for storming Versailles and executing everyone at the party. But here's what makes this story even more surreal. The aristocrats weren't just oblivious to the danger they were in. They seemed to be actively courting it, as if the approaching revolution was just another form of entertainment to be incorporated into their pleasure-seeking lifestyle. The Duc d'Artois organised what he called revolution games, where courtiers would play act at being revolutionaries, complete with mock trials and pretend executions performed as comedy skits for the amusement of their friends. The irony was lost on absolutely no one except the participants themselves. They were literally rehearsing their own destruction while treating it as a joke, and they seemed completely unable to grasp that the pretend revolutionaries gathering outside their gates were deadly serious about making their play acting become reality. The final court season at Versailles, the summer and fall of 1789, was characterized by a manic quality that contemporary observers described as almost supernatural. It was as if the aristocrats had decided that since their world was ending, they might as well go out in the most spectacular fashion possible. Parties became larger, more expensive and more elaborate even as the royal treasury emptied and the political situation became increasingly desperate. The Count de Beugnot, who managed to survive the revolution and write his memoirs years later, described attending a dinner party in September 1789 where the conversation alternated between discussing the latest revolutionary proclamations and planning an upcoming costume ball. "We would spend 1 hour analysing reports of peasant uprisings," he wrote, "and the next hour debating whether the theme for Saturday's entertainment should be ancient Rome or exotic Arabia." It was as if we existed in two completely separate realities simultaneously. What's most heartbreaking about these final parties is how they reveal the complete emotional and psychological bankruptcy that decades of pleasure-seeking had created among the French aristocracy. These people had become so dependent on constant entertainment and stimulation that they literally couldn't function without it, even when their lives were in mortal danger. They were like addicts who couldn't stop using even when they knew their next fix might kill them. The Marquise de Bombelle left behind a diary that perfectly captures this tragic dynamic. In an entry dated October 3rd, 1789, just 2 days before the Women's March on Versailles, that would effectively end the old regime, she wrote, "I know that we are probably going to die, and yet I cannot stop myself from caring desperately about whether my dress for tonight's ball will be ready on time. It is as if my mind has been trained to focus only on pleasures and cannot adjust to contemplating anything as serious as our own destruction." But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these final parties was how they became increasingly desperate and extreme, as if the aristocrats were trying to compress a lifetime of indulgence into their remaining weeks or months of freedom. Drug use, which had been relatively rare at Versailles, became commonplace as nobles sought increasingly intense experiences to distract themselves from their approaching doom. Opium, imported from Turkey at enormous expense, became a fashionable addition to court entertainments. The Duchess de Guiche hosted what she called Oriental dream parties, where guests would consume opium-laced sweets and spend hours in elaborate fantasy scenarios designed to make them forget about the revolution entirely. These parties would last for days, with participants drifting in and out of drug-induced stupors, while servants maintained the illusion that they were living in some timeless paradise where political upheaval couldn't touch them. Sexual behaviour also became more extreme and public as traditional social restraints broke down. The Duc de Richelieu organised orgies that were so elaborate and expensive that they required hiring professional entertainers from across Europe. These weren't private affairs. They were essentially public performances where the sexual activities themselves became forms of theatrical entertainment for an audience of other nobles who were too jaded by conventional pleasures to be satisfied with anything less shocking. But the most disturbing development was how violence began to creep into aristocratic entertainments as the revolution approached. Nobles who had spent decades pursuing increasingly forbidden pleasures began to incorporate elements of actual cruelty and sadism into their parties, as if they were trying to match the intensity of the violence that was building outside their walls. The Count de Sade, yes, that Marquis de Sade's brother, hosted parties that featured elaborate torture scenarios performed on paid volunteers, usually desperate people from the lower classes who were willing to endure physical and psychological abuse in exchange for money that might help their families survive the economic chaos. These entertainments were attended by some of the most powerful people in France, who watched human suffering as if it were just another form of theatre. What makes this even more horrifying is that many of these same nobles would soon experience very similar treatment at the hands of revolutionary crowds, and yet they seemed completely unable to make the connection between the cruelty they were enjoying as entertainment and the cruelty they would soon experience as punishment. The final party at Versailles, the last great entertainment before the royal family was forced to leave for Paris, was held on October 1st, 1789. Marie Antoinette had planned it as a farewell celebration, though she still believed at that point that their departure from Versailles would be temporary, and that they would soon return to resume their normal lifestyle. The party featured performances by the finest musicians in Europe, a banquet with over 100 courses, and elaborate fireworks that could be seen from Paris, where they were interpreted by revolutionary crowds as a deliberate provocation. The total cost was equivalent to approximately $50 million in today's money, spent during a week when bread shortages had led to riots throughout France. But what makes this final party truly tragic is how it perfectly encapsulated everything that had gone wrong with the French aristocracy. It was spectacularly expensive, completely disconnected from political reality, utterly indifferent to the suffering of ordinary people, and ultimately futile. A magnificent display of wealth and privilege that only served to confirm everything the revolutionaries believed about aristocratic corruption and excess. The party ended abruptly when news arrived that a crowd of angry women was marching from Paris toward Versailles, demanding bread and justice. Most of the guests fled immediately, abandoning their half-finished meals and their elaborate costumes in their haste to escape. Marie Antoinette reportedly stood alone in the empty ballroom, still wearing her diamond-encrusted gown, unable to comprehend how her perfect party had been ruined by people she considered beneath her notice. Within days, the royal family would be prisoners in Paris, and the magnificent palace of Versailles would stand empty, its gilded halls echoing with the memory of a century of pleasure-seeking that had ultimately consumed itself. But even then, even as their world collapsed entirely, many aristocrats remained convinced that somehow their lifestyle would be restored, their pleasures would be renewed, and their reign over France would continue. They had no idea that they were about to witness the final brutal lesson in what happens when a society built on the pursuit of forbidden pleasure collides with the harsh realities of human justice and historical change. The magnificent palace that had once housed the most powerful monarchy in Europe stood empty, its golden halls echoing with silence, its elaborate gardens growing wild, and its fountains slowly running dry. But Versailles didn't just die. It was systematically dismantled piece by piece, in a process so thorough and so symbolic that it became one of the most powerful statements about the end of an era that history has ever recorded. And watching how different people reacted to this destruction reveals everything we need to know about what the palace had really meant to French society. When revolutionary forces first entered Versailles in October 1789, their initial reaction wasn't violence, it was wonder. Many of these people had never seen anything like the opulence that surrounded them. Contemporary accounts describe revolutionary soldiers standing in the Hall of Mirrors, literally speechless with amazement at the wealth that had been accumulated while their families struggled to survive. Some of them wept, not from joy, but from a kind of overwhelming grief at the realization of what had been denied to ordinary people for so many generations. But that wonder quickly turned to rage as the revolutionaries began to understand the full scope of what they were seeing. Every golden doorknob, every crystal chandelier, every silk tapestry represented money that could have fed families, built schools, or provided medical care of the sick. The revolutionary leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot wrote that walking through Versailles was like touring a monument to human selfishness, where every beautiful object serves as evidence of crimes against the people of France. The dismantling of Versailles became a kind of reverse archaeology, with revolutionaries carefully cataloguing and removing layers of accumulated luxury that told the story of aristocratic excess. They discovered rooms that most courtiers had never known existed, filled with objects so expensive and so pointless that even hardened revolutionaries were shocked by what they found. In Marie Antoinette's private apartments, they found a collection of over 500 pairs of shoes, many of which had never been worn. In Louis XVI's study, they discovered gambling debts recorded in his own handwriting that totaled more than the annual budget of several French provinces. In the basement storage areas, they found literally tons of discarded luxury items, clothes, jewellery, furniture, art objects that had been purchased, used briefly, and then forgotten because their owners had grown bored with them. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the detailed records that the palace staff had kept of daily expenses. These documents, preserved in the revolutionary archives, provide an almost unbelievable account of how money had been spent during the final years of the monarchy. On a single day in 1788, for example, the cost of flowers for the palace's various rooms exceeded the annual salaries of 200 teachers. The daily wine consumption at Versailles was sufficient to supply a small city, and much of it was simply poured out when it didn't meet the exacting standards of the royal sommelier. The revolutionaries also found evidence of the darker activities we've discussed throughout this story. Hidden rooms contained the paraphernalia of occult ceremonies, including altars, ritual implements, and detailed records of the psychological experiments that had been conducted on unwitting subjects. They discovered correspondence that proved the existence of the secret societies, the poison networks, and the elaborate schemes to manipulate French politics for personal gain. Reading these documents had a profound psychological impact on the revolutionary forces. They realized that they hadn't just been dealing with excessive luxury, they had been subjected to systematic cruelty and manipulation by people who viewed ordinary citizens as nothing more than subjects for experimentation and exploitation, The anger that resulted from these discoveries transformed the revolution from a political movement seeking reform into a moral crusade aimed at completely eliminating what they saw as an evil system. The process of actually dismantling Versailles was both methodical and deeply symbolic. Everything was carefully catalogued, evaluated, and either sold to benefit the new Republican government or destroyed if it was deemed too symbolic of royal oppression to be allowed to continue existing. The famous silver furniture that Louis XIV had commissioned was melted down and turned into coins that were distributed to poor families. The elaborate silk tapestries were cut up and used to make clothing for orphans and widows, but some items were preserved specifically as evidence of aristocratic crimes. The most expensive objects were displayed in Paris as part of what revolutionaries called exhibitions of national shame. Public displays designed to show ordinary citizens exactly how their tax money had been wasted on meaningless luxuries. These exhibitions drew enormous crowds of people who had never imagined that such extravagance was possible. The Marquise de Tourzel, who had served as governess to the royal children, managed to visit one of these exhibitions after escaping France. She wrote that seeing the royal family's possessions displayed as evidence of criminal excess was more painful than witnessing their execution, because it reduced their entire way of life to a catalogue of moral failures and social crimes. Meanwhile, the aristocrats who had survived the initial phases of the revolution were experiencing their own form of psychological dismantling. Stripped of their wealth, their social positions, and their elaborate support systems, many of them simply couldn't function in the new world that was emerging around them. They had become so dependent on luxury and privilege that they were literally incapable of adapting to ordinary life. The Duchess de Polignac, Marie Antoinette's closest friend, managed to escape to Austria, where she lived in exile for the rest of her life. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who was completely broken by the loss of her previous lifestyle. She wrote about being unable to dress herself without the help of multiple servants, about feeling physically ill when forced to eat simple food, about experiencing panic attacks when confronted with the need to make basic decisions about daily life. Many exiled nobles experienced what we would today recognize as severe depression and PTSD. They had nightmares about the revolution, but equally disturbing were their dreams about returning to Versailles and resuming their old lives. The Count de Beugnot wrote that he would wake up believing he was still at court, only to remember that his world had been completely destroyed, creating a psychological shock that was almost unbearable. But perhaps the most tragic figures were the aristocrats who remained in France and tried to adapt to the new Republican society. Most of them failed completely. They'd been so shaped by the culture of Versailles that they couldn't understand how to live without constant entertainment, elaborate rituals, and the assumption that their comfort was more important than anyone else's welfare. The former Duc de Chartres, who renounced his title and tried to become a simple citizen, found himself unable to perform even basic tasks like shopping for food or managing household expenses. He had never in his life been required to consider the cost of anything, and he couldn't adapt to a world where resources were limited and choices had consequences. He eventually committed suicide, leaving behind a note that said he preferred death to the unbearable tedium of ordinary existence. Even more heartbreaking were the stories of aristocratic children who'd been raised in the Versailles system and suddenly found themselves in a world where their sense of entitlement and their complete lack of practical skills made them unemployable and socially impossible. Many of them never successfully adapted to post-revolutionary France, remaining forever displaced persons in their own country. The final symbolic act in the dismantling of Versailles was the destruction of the throne room. Revolutionary forces didn't just remove the throne, they demolished the entire space, tearing down the walls, removing the floor, and eliminating every trace of the room where French kings had held court for over a century. In its place, they created a simple chamber dedicated to the memory of ordinary people who had died as a result of aristocratic excess. The psychological impact of this destruction extended far beyond France. Courts throughout Europe watched in horror as one of the most magnificent palaces in the world was systematically eliminated, understanding that what had happened at Versailles could happen to them as well. The very concept of absolute monarchy based on luxury and privilege had been revealed as fundamentally unstable and ultimately self-destructive. But even as Versailles was being physically destroyed, something interesting was happening. The palace was also being transformed into a symbol and a lesson, a permanent reminder of what happens when power becomes completely separated from responsibility, when luxury becomes more important than human welfare, and when the pursuit of pleasure becomes the primary organizing principle of an entire society. And as we've travelled through this long dark night of French history together, as we've witnessed the rise and fall of a civilization built on forbidden pleasures, we're left with questions that are perhaps more relevant today than they were 2 centuries ago. Because the forces that destroyed Versailles, the appetite for unlimited pleasure, the disconnect between rulers and ruled, the corruption of power by excess, those forces didn't disappear with the French monarchy. They're still with us, still shaping our world, and still presenting us with choices about what kind of society we want to create. As we reach the end of our journey through the gilded corridors and darkened chambers of Versailles, it's time to ask ourselves the most important question of all. What does this story of forbidden pleasures and spectacular collapse teach us about our own world, our own choices, and our own relationship with power, wealth, and the endless human appetite for more? Because the lessons of Versailles aren't safely buried in the past. They're living, breathing warnings that echo through every age, including our own. Standing today in the restored halls of Versailles, now a museum visited by millions of people each year, you can feel the weight of all the stories we've shared tonight. The Hall of Mirrors still gleams with reflected light, but now it reflects the faces of ordinary people from around the world who come to witness what remains of humanity's most spectacular experiment in luxury and excess. What they're really seeing is a monument to a simple but profound truth, that when pleasure becomes the highest value in any society, that society contains the seeds of its own destruction. Let me share with you some numbers that might surprise you. The total cost of building and maintaining Versailles, calculated in today's money, was approximately $50 billion spread over a century and a half. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of many modern countries. It's enough money to provide clean water for every person on Earth, or to fund education for hundreds of millions of children, or to solve homelessness in dozens of nations. Instead, it was spent creating a playground for a few thousand people who ultimately lost everything they thought they were preserving. But here's what's really fascinating about the legacy of Versailles. It didn't just disappear when the revolution ended. Its influence has echoed through history in ways that continue to shape our world today. Every time a political leader builds an unnecessarily lavish residence while their people struggle with basic needs, they're repeating the Versailles pattern. Every time a business executive spends shareholder money on personal luxuries while laying off workers, they're following the same path that led Louis XIV's court to destruction. These psychological patterns we've explored, the addiction to luxury, the disconnect from reality, the use of pleasure as a tool of control, these haven't vanished from human society. They've simply moved to different venues and adapted to different technologies. The secret societies that once met in hidden chambers at Versailles have their modern equivalents in exclusive clubs and private gatherings, where the wealthy and powerful make decisions that affect millions of people who have no voice in the process, and the gambling addiction that consumed the French nobility. Walk through any modern casino and you'll see the same desperate pursuit of intense experience, the same willingness to risk everything for the momentary thrill of potentially winning big. The technology has changed, but the underlying psychology remains exactly the same. Even more unsettling are the modern parallels to the romantic and sexual manipulation that characterized court life at Versailles. In our age of social media and digital connectivity, the tools for psychological manipulation have become more sophisticated and more widely available than anything Louis XIV could have imagined. The ability to influence people through carefully crafted emotional appeals, to create artificial intimacy for strategic purposes, and to use personal relationships as vehicles for gaining power, these capabilities have been democratized and amplified by technology. But perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the story of Versailles is about the relationship between individual choices and systemic outcomes. Every person who participated in the culture of excess at the French court made individual decisions that seemed reasonable from their personal perspective. They were just trying to maintain their social position, enjoy the privileges available to them, and navigate the complex requirements of their particular situation. And yet, collectively, these individual choices created a system that was unsustainable, unjust, and ultimately self-destructive. The tragedy of Versailles wasn't that evil people made evil choices, it was that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary temptations and pressures, made choices that seemed rational in the moment but were catastrophic when multiplied across an entire society. This is perhaps the most relevant lesson for our own time. We live in an era of unprecedented wealth and technological capability, where the gap between the richest and poorest members of society has reached levels not seen since the days of Louis XIV. We have our own versions of the secret societies, the psychological manipulation experiments, the political corruption disguised as entertainment, and the systematic exploitation of ordinary people for the benefit of a privileged few. The question we need to ask ourselves is, are we learning from the mistakes of Versailles, or are we repeating them with more sophisticated tools? Are we creating a society that values human welfare and sustainable prosperity, or are we building our own version of a golden cage that will eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? The story of Versailles teaches us that pleasure itself isn't the problem. Human beings deserve joy, beauty, art, music, good food, comfortable homes, and meaningful relationships. The problem arises when the pursuit of pleasure becomes disconnected from responsibility, when luxury becomes more important than justice, and when the happiness of a few becomes more valuable than the welfare of many. The French aristocracy didn't fall because they enjoyed beautiful things. They fell because they created a system where beautiful things could only be obtained through the suffering of others, where pleasure required the systematic exploitation of human beings, and where maintaining their lifestyle became more important than maintaining their humanity. As you settle into sleep tonight, carrying these stories with you into your dreams, remember that history isn't just something that happened to other people in distant times. History is the record of human choices and their consequences, and we're all making history right now through the choices we make every single day. The lessons of Versailles challenge us to think carefully about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice for comfort and pleasure, and what kind of world we're creating for future generations. They remind us that individual luxury built on collective suffering is ultimately an illusion, that true security and genuine happiness can only be sustained when they're available to everyone, not just to a privileged few. The Palace of Versailles still stands today, but it stands as a museum rather than a seat of power. Millions of people walk through its halls each year, marveling at its beauty while also learning about the human cost of the lifestyle it once supported. In a way, this transformation represents the best possible outcome. the preservation of beauty and artistry combined with an honest reckoning with the moral failures that created them. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson we can take from our journey through the forbidden pleasures of Versailles, that human beings are capable of creating extraordinary beauty and achieving remarkable luxury, but only when those achievements are built on foundations of justice, sustainability, and genuine care for human welfare. When pleasure becomes separated from wisdom, when luxury becomes divorced from responsibility, the result is always the same: a spectacular rise followed by an inevitable fall. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through one of history's most fascinating and troubling chapters. Tonight, we've explored the depths of human appetite, the complexity of power, and the ultimate consequences of choosing pleasure over wisdom. These stories from centuries past continue to speak to us today because the fundamental challenges they reveal: how to balance individual desire with collective welfare, how to enjoy prosperity without losing our humanity, how to create beauty without causing suffering. These challenges are as relevant now as they ever were. As you drift off to sleep, let these tales of Versailles remind you that we all have the power to choose wisdom over indulgence, justice over privilege, and sustainable happiness over temporary pleasure. The future is still being written, and each of us gets to contribute our own chapter to the story of human civilization. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the hidden corners of history, where the past continues to illuminate the present and guide us toward a better future. Until then, sleep well, and remember that the most forbidden pleasure of all might just be the simple joy of living with integrity in a complex world.